The emergence of the Livonian Brothers of the Sword represented a calculated fusion of ecclesiastical ambition and military pragmatism, born from the vision of one man whose determination would reshape the Baltic region for centuries. Bishop Albert of Riga, whose full name was Albert von Buxhoeveden, arrived in Livonia in 1200 with a mandate that extended far beyond traditional missionary work. The young bishop, barely 30 years old, possessed both the theological training of Augustinian canon and the political acumen necessary to navigate the treacherous waters of medieval Baltic politics. Albert's appointment to the bishopric of Livonia came through the direct intervention of his uncle Hartwig II of Bremen, who recognised that conventional missionary efforts had proven woefully inadequate in converting the pagan tribes of the eastern Baltic. Previous attempts at peaceful evangelization, including the martyrdom of Saint Meinhard and the brief tenure of Bishop Berthold, had demonstrated that the indigenous Livonian, Estonian and Latvian populations would not abandon their ancestral beliefs through persuasion alone. The pagan tribes, organised into loose confederations of chieftains and village elders, had shown remarkable resistance to Christian influence, often viewing missionaries as harbingers of foreign domination rather than spiritual salvation. The bishop's strategic mind immediately grasped the fundamental challenge facing Christian expansion in the region. Unlike the successful crusades in the Holy Land, where established kingdoms and recognisable political structures existed, the Baltic territories presented a fragmented landscape of tribal societies, each fiercely protective of their territorial boundaries and religious traditions. The Livonians themselves, a Finno-Ugric people, controlled the lower reaches of the Daugava River and maintained extensive trade networks with both Scandinavian merchants and Russian principalities. Their religious practices centred around sacred groves, stone circles and elaborate burial customs that had persisted for centuries without external interference. Albert's vision transcended mere conversion. He envisioned the establishment of a permanent Christian state that would serve as both a bulwark against Orthodox Russian expansion and a launching point for further missionary activities throughout the Baltic region. This ambitious plan required military force capable of sustained operations, not merely the temporary presence of crusading armies that would return to their homelands after brief campaigns. The bishop understood that success demanded the creation of a permanent military institution, one that would combine the martial prowess of knightly warfare with the spiritual dedication of monastic life. The papal authorization that legitimized Albert's military ambitions came through a series of bulls issued by Pope Innocent III, whose pontificate marked the zenith of papal temporal power. The most significant of these, issued in 1204, granted Albert the authority to organize crusading expeditions against the pagan tribes of Livonia and Estonia, offering the same spiritual indulgences traditionally reserved for participants in the Holy Land Crusades. This papal endorsement transformed what might have been viewed as territorial aggression into a sacred mission, providing the theological framework necessary to attract knights and financial supporters from across the Holy Roman Empire. Innocent III's support extended beyond mere spiritual authorization. The Pope actively promoted the Livonian Crusade through his extensive network of bishops and abbots, encouraging the recruitment of knights and the collection of funds throughout German territories. The papal chancery produced numerous documents outlining the theological justification for armed conquest against pagans, drawing upon established precedents from the Spanish Reconquista and the ongoing conflicts with Muslim forces in the eastern Mediterranean. These documents emphasize the duty of Christian knights to extend the boundaries of Christendom through military action, framing the Baltic campaigns as essential to the broader struggle between Christianity and paganism. The ecclesiastical support network that emerged around Albert's mission represented a sophisticated organizational structure that extended far beyond the Baltic region. Archbishop Hartwig of Bremen served as the primary coordinator for recruitment efforts throughout northern Germany, while bishops in Saxony, Westphalia, and other German territories actively promoted participation in the Livonian Crusades from their pulpits. Monasteries provided both financial support and educated personnel capable of managing the complex administrative requirements of establishing a new Christian territory in hostile lands. Now, the recruitment of German knights for Albert's military order drew upon established networks of noble families who had participated in previous crusading ventures. Unlike the temporary commitments typical of traditional crusading expeditions, Albert sought knights willing to establish permanent residence in Livonia, abandoning their ancestral holdings in exchange for the promise of new territories conquered from pagan tribes. This requirement attracted a particular type of warrior, younger sons of noble families who possessed military training but lacked significant inheritance prospects, ambitious knights seeking to establish independent lordships, and veterans of previous crusades who had developed a taste for frontier warfare. The founding members of the Brothers of the Sword included Vinno von Röhrbach, who became the order's first master, along with knights from prominent German families such as the von Segerwalds, von Tiesenhausens and von Rosen. These men brought with them not only personal military expertise, but also connections to the broader German nobility, ensuring continued recruitment and financial support for the order's operations. The initial membership numbered approximately 20 knights, each accompanied by several armed retainers and support personnel, creating a core military force of roughly 100 experienced warriors. The military structure of the Brothers of the Sword reflected established patterns from other military orders, particularly the Knights Templar and the Teutonic Knights, but adapted to the specific requirements of Baltic warfare. The order's hierarchy placed the master at its apex, with authority over all military and administrative decisions. Below him ranked the Knight Brothers, who had taken monastic vows and committed themselves permanently to the order's service. Supporting these full brothers were associate members, including sergeants-at-arms, chaplains, and various specialists necessary for maintaining military operations in a hostile environment. The distinctive visual identity of the Brothers of the Sword served both practical and symbolic functions in establishing their presence throughout the Baltic region. Their white mantles, made from heavy wool suitable for the harsh northern climate, bore red swords embroidered across the chest, creating an unmistakable symbol of their military and religious mission. This heraldic device drew inspiration from the red crosses worn by other crusading orders, while incorporating the sword motif that emphasized their commitment to armed evangelization. The white color symbolized purity of purpose and monastic dedication, while the red sword represented both the blood of martyrdom and the instrument of divine justice against pagans. The practical aspects of the order's military equipment reflected the realities of warfare in the densely forested and swampy terrain characteristic of the Baltic region. Knights wore mail hauberks beneath their distinctive mantles, providing protection against the spears and arrows favoured by indigenous warriors, while maintaining sufficient mobility for operations in difficult terrain. Their weapons included heavy cavalry lances for mounted charges, long swords for close combat, and crossbows for siege warfare and forest fighting where traditional cavalry tactics proved ineffective. The construction of Riga as the Order's primary stronghold represented Albert's most significant achievement in establishing a permanent Christian presence in Livonia. The site, located at the confluence of the Daugava River and the Baltic Sea, offered exceptional strategic advantages for both military operations and commercial activities. The location provided access to river transportation deep into the continental interior, while maintaining direct connections to German ports across the Baltic Sea. The natural harbour could accommodate the largest vessels of the era, ensuring reliable communication and supply lines with the Order's supporters in the Holy Roman Empire. Albert's urban planning for Riga demonstrated sophisticated understanding of medieval fortification principles adapted to local conditions. The initial construction focused on a fortified compound that combined religious, military, and administrative functions within a single defensive perimeter. The cathedral, begun in 1211, served as both the spiritual centre of the new Christian territory and a fortress capable of withstanding siege warfare. Its massive stone walls, constructed using local limestone quarried from nearby deposits, rose to heights exceeding those of most contemporary German cathedrals, creating an imposing symbol of Christian authority visible for miles across the surrounding landscape. The military quarters within Riga's fortifications included barracks capable of housing the order's entire complement of knights and their retainers, along with extensive stables for the war horses essential to their military effectiveness. Workshops for maintaining weapons and armour occupied separate buildings designed to minimise fire hazards, while granaries and other storage facilities ensured the garrison could withstand extended sieges. The complex included a separate residence for Bishop Albert, whose authority as both religious and secular leader of the territory required appropriate accommodation for diplomatic functions and administrative activities. The administrative centre established within Riga's walls reflected the complex legal and governmental structures necessary for managing a frontier territory populated by diverse ethnic and religious groups. Albert's chancery produced documents in Latin, German, and various local languages, requiring a staff of educated clerks capable of managing correspondence with papal authorities, German nobles, and indigenous tribal leaders. The legal system combined canon law, German customary law, and pragmatic accommodations to local practices, creating a hybrid governmental structure that would persist throughout the order's existence. The economic foundation of the new Christian state rested upon Albert's recognition that military conquest alone could not sustain long-term occupation of the Baltic territories. The bishop actively encouraged German merchants to establish trading posts in Riga, offering favourable terms and legal protections that attracted commercial investment from Lübeck, Hamburg, and other Hanseatic cities. The resulting influx of German craftsmen, traders, and settlers created an urban population capable of supporting the order's military activities while generating the tax revenues necessary for continued expansion. The early missionary activities conducted from Riga revealed the complex relationship between military conquest and religious conversion that characterized the order's approach to evangelization. Albert employed a combination of force and persuasion, using military pressure to compel tribal leaders to accept baptism while simultaneously offering economic incentives and political accommodations to ease the transition to Christianity. The bishop's pragmatic approach recognized that superficial conversion achieved through coercion required ongoing reinforcement through positive inducements and gradual cultural transformation. The resistance encountered by the Brothers of the Sword during their initial campaigns demonstrated the sophisticated military capabilities of the indigenous populations they sought to conquer. Livonian warriors, while lacking the heavy cavalry and siege equipment available to their German opponents, possessed intimate knowledge of local terrain and employed guerrilla tactics that neutralized many advantages of knightly warfare. The wooden hill forts, constructed on elevated positions surrounded by swamps and dense forests, proved remarkably difficult to assault using conventional medieval siege techniques. The order's adaptation to these challenging conditions required significant modifications to traditional German military practices. Knights learned to fight on foot in forest environments where cavalry charges proved impossible, while engineers developed new techniques for constructing siege equipment from local materials. The brothers also recruited indigenous auxiliaries, offering military service as an alternative to conversion for pagan warriors willing to serve Christian masters. These auxiliary forces provided essential local knowledge and specialized skills in forest warfare that proved crucial to the order's eventual success. The systematic conquest of the Livonian territories began in earnest following the establishment of Riga as a secure base of operations. The Brothers of the Sword, now numbering approximately 40 knights with their supporting retainers, initiated their first major military campaign along the Daugava River Valley in the spring of 1210. Master Vinno von Röhrbach personally led this expedition, recognizing that control of the river represented the key to dominating the entire region. The Daugava served as the primary commercial artery, connecting the Baltic coast with the Russian principalities of Polotsk and Novgorod, making its conquest essential for both strategic and economic reasons. The indigenous Livonian settlements along the river presented formidable defensive challenges despite their relatively modest size. Each village occupied elevated positions on riverbanks or islands, surrounded by extensive wooden palisades constructed from massive oak logs driven deep into the marshy ground. These fortifications, known locally as Pilskalny, incorporated sophisticated defensive features including overlapping fields of fire for archers, concealed sally ports for surprise attacks, and elaborate systems of ditches and earthworks designed to channel attacking forces into predetermined killing zones. The largest of these settlements, Ixkile, commanded a strategic position approximately 30 kilometers upstream from Riga and housed nearly 800 inhabitants under the leadership of a chieftain named Akko. The brothers' initial assault on Ixkile in June 1210 demonstrated both the effectiveness of their military organization and the limitations imposed by local conditions. The knights approached the settlement in traditional formation, with heavy cavalry positioned for a coordinated charge, while crossbowmen provided covering fire from prepared positions. However, the marshy terrain surrounding the village prevented effective deployment of mounted forces, compelling the attackers to dismount and advance on foot through treacherous ground that offered numerous opportunities for ambush. Livonian defenders, armed primarily with spears, bows and battle axes, maintained a disciplined resistance from behind their wooden ramparts while launching frequent sorties designed to disrupt the German siege preparations. The siege lasted 17 days before Akko agreed to negotiate surrender terms. The Livonian chieftain, recognizing the futility of prolonged resistance against an enemy capable of maintaining indefinite siege operations, accepted baptism along with his immediate family and principal warriors. However, this apparent conversion masked continued adherence to traditional religious practices, as Bishop Albert's subsequent investigations revealed the persistence of pagan rituals conducted in secret locations throughout the conquered territory. The bishop's response established a pattern that would characterize the order's approach to religious conversion throughout their expansion. Formal acceptance of Christianity combined with systematic destruction of indigenous sacred sites and the establishment of permanent Christian institutions to monitor compliance with the new faith. The conquest of the Daugava Valley proceeded methodically throughout the summer and autumn of 1210, with each captured settlement providing intelligence about neighbouring communities and their defensive capabilities. The brothers employed a combination of direct assault, siege warfare, and psychological intimidation to compel submission from tribal leaders. At Salaspils, a fortified settlement controlling a crucial river crossing, the knights constructed elaborate siege engines, including a massive trebuchet capable of hurling stones weighing over 100 kilograms against the wooden palisades. The psychological impact of these weapons proved as significant as their physical destructive power, as many defenders had never witnessed such sophisticated military technology. The establishment of feudal administration in conquered territories required careful balancing of competing interests among the various German factions involved in the conquest. Bishop Albert retained direct control over approximately one-third of all conquered lands, designating these territories as episcopal domains subject to ecclesiastical rather than secular authority. The Brothers of the Sword received grants encompassing another third of the conquered territory, with these lands serving as the economic foundation for maintaining their military operations. The remaining territories were distributed among German settlers, both noble and common, who had participated in the conquest or provided essential financial support for the military campaigns. This tripartite division of conquered lands created complex administrative challenges that required sophisticated legal frameworks to resolve disputes and coordinate governance. The Livonian legal code, developed during this period under Bishop Albert's supervision, combined elements of German feudal law with practical accommodations to local conditions and customs. German settlers received hereditary rights to their granted lands, subject to military service obligations and payment of specified taxes to support the order's operations. Indigenous populations who accepted Christianity retained limited rights to cultivate designated agricultural lands, though they remained subject to various restrictions designed to prevent organised resistance against German authority. The construction of stone castles throughout the conquered territory served both military and administrative functions in establishing permanent German control. These fortifications, built using local limestone and timber, incorporated architectural features adapted from contemporary German castle design while accommodating the specific defensive requirements of frontier warfare. Venden Castle, begun in 1214 on the site of a former Livonian hill fort, exemplified this architectural synthesis. The structure featured massive stone walls rising directly from rocky foundations, with towers positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire across all approaches. The interior courtyard accommodated barracks for a permanent garrison of 20 knights and their retainers, along with workshops, stables, and storage facilities necessary for independent operation during extended sieges. The forced conversion policies implemented by the Brothers of the Sword reflected Bishop Albert's understanding that superficial acceptance of Christianity required reinforcement through systematic elimination of pagan religious infrastructure. The destruction of sacred groves represented a particularly significant aspect of this campaign, as these woodland sanctuaries served as focal points for traditional Livonian religious practices. The largest of these sites, located near present-day Cessis, encompassed over 50 hectares of ancient oak forest, where tribal priests had conducted seasonal ceremonies for centuries. The brothers' systematic burning of these sacred woods, accompanied by the construction of Christian chapels on the same sites, symbolized the replacement of pagan spiritual authority with Christian religious institutions. The establishment of Christian parishes throughout conquered territories required recruitment of German clergy willing to serve in frontier conditions far removed from the comfort and security of established ecclesiastical centres. Bishop Albert's correspondence with monasteries throughout the Holy Roman Empire reveals the challenges involved in attracting qualified priests to serve indigenous populations, whose conversion remained superficial and potentially reversible. Many of the clergy who accepted these assignments were younger men seeking advancement opportunities unavailable in more established dioceses, though some were genuine missionaries motivated by evangelical zeal for converting pagan populations. The parish system established in conquered Livonian territories incorporated features designed specifically to monitor and reinforce religious conversion among indigenous populations. Each parish church served not only as a centre for Christian worship, but also as an administrative headquarters where German officials recorded births, deaths, marriages, and other vital statistics that provided detailed information about local population movements and potential security threats. Parish priests received explicit instructions to report any evidence of continued pagan practices, including participation in traditional seasonal festivals, consultation with indigenous healers, or burial customs that deviated from Christian norms. The resistance movements that emerged in response to German conquest demonstrated sophisticated coordination among tribal leaders who recognized the existential threat posed by Christian expansion. The most significant of these resistance efforts began in 1212 under the leadership of Viestards, a semi-Gallian chieftain whose territories lay southeast of the conquered Livonian settlements. Viestards possessed extensive military experience gained through conflicts with neighbouring tribes and maintained diplomatic connections with the Russian Principality of Polotsk, which provided both military assistance and sanctuary for refugees fleeing German occupation. The guerrilla warfare tactics employed by indigenous resistance forces posed unprecedented challenges for the Brothers of the Sword, whose military training emphasized conventional knightly combat rather than the irregular warfare characteristic of forest fighting. Livonian and semi-Gallian warriors avoided direct confrontation with German heavy cavalry, instead launching surprise attacks against isolated outposts, supply convoys, and small detachments separated from main force concentrations. These attacks typically occurred during dawn or dusk hours when visibility limitations neutralized the technological advantages of German military equipment, while dense forest cover prevented effective pursuit of retreating indigenous forces. The most devastating resistance attack occurred in September 1213, when Wehrstads led a coordinated assault against the German settlement at Mizotne. The attack began with diversionary raids against outlying farms that drew the garrison's attention away from the main settlement, allowing approximately 200 semi-Gallian warriors to approach undetected through surrounding forests. The assault commenced with volleys of fire arrows that ignited thatch roofs throughout the settlement, creating chaos and confusion that prevented organised defensive response. German casualties included 12 knights and over 30 settlers, while the attackers captured significant quantities of weapons, armour, and other military supplies before withdrawing into the forest. The brothers' response to this defeat revealed both their military adaptability and their determination to maintain control over conquered territories, regardless of the costs involved. Master Vinno von Röhrbach organised a punitive expedition comprising the Order's entire available military strength. Approximately 60 knights with supporting infantry and auxiliary forces recruited from converted Livonian communities. This force conducted systematic devastation of semi-Gallian territories throughout the winter of 1213 to 1214, burning villages, destroying food stores, and driving civilian populations into refugee camps where they faced starvation and disease. The psychological warfare employed during these punitive campaigns included deliberate atrocities designed to discourage further resistance among indigenous populations. German forces executed captured warriors in public ceremonies intended to demonstrate the futility of opposing Christian authority, while civilian populations faced forced relocation away from traditional homelands. These harsh measures achieved their intended effect of reducing active resistance, though they also created lasting resentment among indigenous communities that would manifest in future rebellions when opportunities arose. The establishment of German agricultural colonies throughout conquered territories served multiple functions in consolidating Christian control over the Baltic region. These settlements provided secure bases for military operations while generating agricultural surpluses necessary to support the growing German population. The colonists themselves, recruited primarily from overpopulated regions of northern Germany, brought advanced farming techniques and crop varieties that increased overall agricultural productivity. However, their presence also displaced indigenous populations from traditional farming areas, creating additional sources of tension that resistance movements exploited in their propaganda efforts. The economic transformation of conquered territories extended beyond agriculture to include development of craft production and commercial activities that integrated the Baltic region into broader European trade networks. German artisans established workshops producing weapons, tools, and other manufactured goods using both imported materials and local resources. The expansion of iron production proved particularly significant as German miners and smiths introduced advanced techniques for extracting and processing iron ore deposits that indigenous populations had utilized only minimally. This industrial development provided the Brothers of the Sword with reliable sources of military equipment while generating tax revenues essential for financing continued expansion. The diplomatic challenges posed by Russian intervention in Baltic affairs required careful navigation to prevent the formation of a powerful anti-German coalition. The Principality of Polotsk, ruled by Prince Vladimir, maintained traditional tributary relationships with several Livonian and semi-Gallian tribes that predated German arrival in the region. Vladimir's support for indigenous resistance movements included provision of weapons, military advisors, and sanctuary for refugees fleeing German occupation. However, his resources remained limited due to ongoing conflicts with other Russian principalities, preventing large-scale military intervention that might have reversed German conquests. The Brothers of the Sword's expansion into Estonian territories beginning in 1217 opened a new phase of conquest that would test their military capabilities against more formidable opposition. The Estonian tribes, organised into larger political units than their Livonian neighbours, possessed greater military resources and maintained stronger defensive positions in hill forts that rivaled contemporary European fortifications in their sophistication. The largest of these strongholds, Lindenice, commanded the approaches to present-day Tallinn and housed over 1,500 warriors under the leadership of an experienced war chief named Lembitu. The Estonian campaigns represented the most ambitious expansion undertaken by the Livonian Brothers of the Sword, requiring unprecedented coordination between German and Danish forces in a theatre of operations that stretched across hundreds of kilometres of hostile territory. The Estonian tribes, unlike their Livonian neighbours to the south, had developed sophisticated political structures centred around powerful regional chieftains who commanded substantial military resources and maintained extensive fortification networks throughout their territories. These defensive systems, built upon elevated positions that dominated surrounding landscapes, incorporated advanced engineering techniques including multiple defensive perimeters, underground passages connecting different sections of fortifications, and elaborate water management systems that could sustain lengthy sieges. The Danish involvement in the Northern Crusades originated from King Valdemar II's broader strategy of establishing Danish hegemony throughout the Baltic region. Valdemar, known as the Victorious, had already achieved significant territorial expansion through conquests in Pomerania and other Slavic territories along the southern Baltic coast. His interest in Estonian conquest reflected both religious motivations, consistent with crusading ideology, and practical considerations regarding control of lucrative trade routes, connecting Novgorod with Western European markets. The Danish fleet, comprising over 200 vessels including specialised transport ships designed for amphibious operations, provided capabilities that complemented the land-based military strengths of the German crusading forces. The initial coordination between Danish and German forces required extensive diplomatic negotiations to establish command structures and territorial divisions that would prevent conflicts between Allied forces during active campaigns. Bishop Albert of Riga travelled personally to the Danish court in 1219 to negotiate agreements that designated specific operational zones for each force, while establishing procedures for coordinating major offensive operations against Estonian strongholds. These agreements recognised Danish primacy in northern Estonian territories, while confirming German authority over southern regions that connected with existing Livonian conquests. The diplomatic framework also addressed crucial logistical issues including supply arrangements, intelligence sharing, and protocols for managing captured territories and populations. The Estonian military organisation that confronted this Christian alliance demonstrated remarkable sophistication in both defensive planning and offensive capabilities. Estonian warriors, equipped with iron-tipped spears, battle axes, and composite bows constructed from local materials, possessed extensive experience in forest warfare gained through centuries of conflicts with neighbouring tribes and periodic raids against Russian settlements. Their tactical doctrine emphasised mobility and terrain advantage, utilising intimate knowledge of local geography to conduct ambush operations and strategic withdrawals that maximised casualties among attacking forces while preserving their own military strength for subsequent engagements. The fortification systems protecting major Estonian settlements represented architectural achievements that rivaled contemporary European castle design in their defensive effectiveness. Otepää, one of the principal Estonian strongholds, occupied a naturally elevated position, surrounded by extensive earthworks that channeled attacking forces into predetermined killing zones, where defenders could concentrate their fire from multiple directions. The fortification's wooden palisades, constructed from massive oak logs imported from distant forests, rose to heights exceeding 8 meters and incorporated sophisticated defensive features, including projecting bastions that eliminated blind spots in the defensive perimeter. Underground storage chambers carved into bedrock provided secure locations for food supplies, weapons, and other essential materials necessary for withstanding extended siege operations. The siege of Otepää in the summer of 1220 demonstrated the tactical innovations required for successful operations against Estonian defensive positions. The combined German-Danish force, numbering approximately 400 knights with supporting infantry and siege specialists, established multiple camps surrounding the fortress to prevent escape or resupply of the garrison. German engineers constructed elaborate siege engines, including mangonels and ballistae, capable of launching projectiles against the wooden palisades, while Danish naval carpenters contributed expertise in constructing mobile siege towers that could approach the fortification walls despite the challenging terrain. The siege lasted 43 days before Estonian defenders, facing starvation and dwindling ammunition supplies, agreed to negotiate surrender terms. The capture of Otepää provided crucial intelligence regarding Estonian military capabilities and defensive strategies that informed subsequent operations against other fortified positions. Interrogation of captured Estonian warriors revealed the existence of extensive communication networks connecting different strongholds, including sophisticated signal systems using fire beacons and horn calls that could coordinate defensive responses across vast territorial distances. This intelligence prompted modifications to German tactical approaches, emphasizing rapid movement and simultaneous attacks against multiple objectives to prevent coordinated Estonian resistance efforts. The advance toward Fellin represented the most challenging phase of the Estonian campaign due to the fortress's exceptional strategic importance and formidable defensive capabilities. Fellin commanded crucial transportation routes connecting Estonian territories with Russian trading networks, making its capture essential for establishing effective control over the broader region. The fortress itself occupied a commanding position atop a steep-sided hill that rose nearly 60 meters above surrounding wetlands, with approaches limited to narrow causeways that could be easily defended by relatively small forces. Estonian engineers had enhanced these natural advantages through construction of multiple defensive perimeters, each designed to slow attacking forces while exposing them to concentrated defensive fire from elevated positions. The Estonian garrison at Fellin, commanded by a veteran war leader named Lembitu, comprised over 800 warriors drawn from several tribal confederations that had united specifically to resist Christian expansion. Lembitu possessed extensive military experience gained through decades of warfare against neighbouring tribes and Russian principalities, and his tactical expertise had earned respect throughout Estonian territories. Under his leadership, the fortress garrison had accumulated substantial supplies of weapons, food, and other materials necessary for prolonged resistance, while defensive preparations included construction of additional earthworks and installation of specialized equipment for siege warfare. The German assault on Fellin commenced in September 1221, with preliminary operations designed to isolate the fortress from external support while gathering intelligence about defensive preparations. Reconnaissance patrols, comprising German knights accompanied by converted Livonian guides familiar with local terrain, conducted systematic mapping of approaches to the fortress while identifying potential weaknesses in the defensive perimeter. These operations revealed the existence of concealed sally ports that allowed garrison forces to launch surprise attacks against besieging forces, prompting modifications to German siege tactics that emphasized constant vigilance and rapid response capabilities. The construction of German siege works around Fellin required innovative engineering solutions to overcome the challenging topographical conditions surrounding the fortress. German military engineers, drawing upon experience gained during previous siege operations in the Holy Land and other crusading theatres, designed specialised equipment adapted to local conditions, including lightweight mangonels that could be transported across marshy terrain and assembled rapidly in prepared positions. The siege camp itself incorporated defensive features designed to protect German forces from Estonian sortie attacks, including ditches, palisades, and strategically positioned guard towers that provided overlapping fields of observation across all approaches to German positions. The psychological warfare employed during the siege of Fellin included deliberate demonstrations of German military capabilities designed to discourage continued resistance among Estonian defenders. German forces conducted regular displays of siege engine effectiveness, launching projectiles against sections of the fortress walls while maintaining careful observation of defensive responses to gauge garrison morale and ammunition supplies. These demonstrations were accompanied by offers of favourable surrender terms that promised preservation of life and property for Estonian warriors willing to accept Christian baptism and acknowledge German authority over their territories. The breakthrough at Fellin occurred after 67 days of siege operations, when German engineers succeeded in undermining a section of the fortress's outer palisade through systematic excavation operations conducted under cover of mobile protective screens. The collapse of this defensive barrier created a breach approximately 15 metres wide that allowed German assault forces to penetrate the fortress's outer perimeter despite fierce Estonian resistance. The subsequent fighting within the fortress compound demonstrated the exceptional courage and skill of Estonian warriors who continued organised resistance even after their primary defensive positions had been compromised. Lembitu's death during the final assault on Fellin marked the effective end of coordinated Estonian resistance in the southern regions of their territory. The veteran war leader fell while leading a desperate counterattack designed to recapture the breached section of the fortress wall. His body discovered among dozens of Estonian and German casualties who had died in hand-to-hand combat within the narrow confines of the defensive breach. His death demoralised remaining Estonian defenders and prompted negotiations that resulted in surrender of the fortress, along with acknowledgement of German authority over the surrounding territories. The establishment of German administration in captured Estonian territories required careful attention to the complex ethnic and political relationships that characterised the region's indigenous populations. Estonian society, organised around extended kinship networks and territorial chieftains, differed significantly from the feudal structures familiar to German administrators. The integration of Estonian territories into the emerging Crusader state necessitated development of hybrid governmental systems that incorporated elements of German feudal law while accommodating traditional Estonian customs and practices that did not directly conflict with Christian religious requirements. The construction of new fortifications throughout conquered Estonian territories served both defensive and administrative functions in establishing permanent German control. These structures, built using local stone and timber resources, incorporated architectural features adapted from contemporary German castle design while addressing specific defensive requirements imposed by Estonian geographical conditions. Viljandi Castle, constructed on the site of the former Estonian fortress at Fellin, exemplified this architectural synthesis through its combination of massive stone walls with wooden defensive structures designed to withstand both conventional siege warfare and the guerrilla tactics favoured by indigenous resistance movements. The economic integration of Estonian territories into the broader German colonial system required systematic development of agricultural and commercial activities that could generate revenues necessary for maintaining military garrisons and administrative structures. German colonists, recruited from overpopulated regions of northern Germany and Denmark, established agricultural settlements throughout conquered territories while introducing advanced farming techniques and crop varieties that increased overall productivity. These colonial settlements provided secure bases for military operations while creating economic incentives for peaceful cooperation among indigenous populations who could benefit from participation in expanded trade networks. The religious conversion campaigns conducted in conquered Estonian territories revealed the persistent challenges involved in transforming deeply rooted pagan belief systems through external pressure and inducement. Estonian religious practices, centered around sacred groves, stone circles, and elaborate seasonal festivals, had developed over centuries into comprehensive worldviews that integrated spiritual beliefs with practical knowledge about agriculture, medicine, and social organization. The systematic destruction of these religious sites, accompanied by construction of Christian churches and chapels, represented only the initial phase of a conversion process that would require decades of sustained effort to achieve meaningful results. The Battle of St. Matthew's Day, fought on September 21, 1217, demonstrated the decisive impact of coordinated Danish naval operations in securing Estonian coastal territories for Christian forces. The Danish fleet, commanded by King Valdemar II personally, achieved complete tactical surprise through nighttime approach operations that positioned Danish vessels within striking distance of the Estonian stronghold at Lindenisse before defenders could organise effective resistance. The subsequent amphibious assault, involving over 1,500 Danish warriors supported by specialised siege equipment transported aboard the invasion fleet, overwhelmed Estonian coastal defences within hours of the initial landing operations. The Danish victory at Lindenisse provided crucial strategic advantages that facilitated subsequent German operations in southern Estonian territories through establishment of secure supply lines and communication networks connecting different theatres of crusading operations. The capture of this major Estonian stronghold eliminated the primary base for indigenous naval operations that had previously threatened German shipping along the Baltic coast, while providing Danish forces with a secure harbour capable of supporting large-scale military operations throughout the northern Baltic region. The psychological impact of this decisive victory contributed significantly to the collapse of Estonian resistance efforts by demonstrating the futility of opposing the combined military capabilities of the Christian alliance. The establishment of Terra Mariana as a unified crusader state represented the culmination of 2 decades of systematic conquest and colonization throughout the Baltic region. This political entity, formally recognized by Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II through imperial charter issued in 1226, encompassed all territories conquered by German and Danish forces during the Northern Crusades, while establishing legal frameworks for continued expansion into remaining pagan territories. The territorial boundaries of Terra Mariana extended from the Gulf of Finland in the north to the Daugava River in the south, encompassing approximately 60,000 square kilometres of territory that included diverse geographical regions ranging from coastal plains to dense forests and extensive wetland systems. The consolidation of Terra Mariana as a unified crusader state created unprecedented tensions between the various German authorities who had participated in its conquest. Bishop Albert of Riga, now approaching his 60th year, found his ecclesiastical authority increasingly challenged by the military leadership of the Livonian Brothers of the Sword, whose successful campaigns had generated expectations of greater autonomy in governing their territorial holdings. The fundamental dispute centred on the interpretation of papal bulls and imperial charters that had established the legal framework for conquest, with each party claiming superior authority over specific aspects of territorial administration, taxation rights, and military command structures. Master Volkwin von Winterstetten, who had assumed leadership of the brothers following the death of Vinno von Rörbach in 1226, possessed both extensive military experience and sophisticated understanding of feudal law that enabled him to articulate legal challenges to episcopal authority with unprecedented precision. Volkwin had served previously with the Teutonic Knights in Prussia, where he had observed the operational advantages enjoyed by military orders that maintained independence from local episcopal interference. His legal arguments drew upon established precedents from other Crusader territories, particularly the Principality of Antioch and the Kingdom of Jerusalem, where military orders had successfully asserted autonomous jurisdiction over their territorial holdings, despite initial subordination to ecclesiastical authorities. The specific territorial disputes that emerged between Albert and Volkwin concern the most economically valuable regions of the conquered territories, particularly the commercial centres along the Daugava River and the agricultural districts that generated substantial tax revenues. Albert maintained that his episcopal authority, derived directly from papal appointment, encompassed all aspects of governance within his diocese, including military matters that affected the spiritual welfare of Christian populations. The bishop's position received support from canon law experts who argued that crusading conquests automatically fell under ecclesiastical jurisdiction due to their religious character, making military orders subordinate institutions responsible for implementing episcopal policies rather than independent authorities. Volkwin's counter-arguments emphasized the military realities of frontier governance, asserting that effective defense against pagan threats required unified command structures free from ecclesiastical interference in tactical and strategic decision-making. The master cited numerous examples of military disasters that had resulted from divided command authority in other crusading territories, including the catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Hattin in 1187, which he attributed partly to conflicts between military and ecclesiastical leaders. His legal briefs, prepared with assistance from German jurists familiar with imperial law, argued that military orders possessed inherent rights to govern territories conquered through their own military efforts, subject only to general oversight from papal and imperial authorities, rather than detailed supervision by local bishops. The practical manifestations of this authority dispute created administrative chaos throughout Terra Mariana as competing bureaucratic systems attempted to exercise jurisdiction over the same territories and populations. German colonists found themselves subject to contradictory tax assessments from both episcopal and military administrations, while indigenous populations faced conflicting legal requirements regarding military service obligations, religious observances, and commercial activities. The resulting confusion provided opportunities for resistance movements among converted populations who exploited administrative disagreements to avoid compliance with unpopular policies imposed by either authority. The most serious confrontation between Albert and Volkwin occurred in the summer of 1229, when the bishop attempted to assert direct control over Wenden Castle, the brothers' principal stronghold in the Livonian heartland. Albert's justification for this action rested upon his claim that the castle's strategic importance required episcopal oversight to ensure coordination with broader defensive planning for the entire territory. The bishop arrived at Wenden accompanied by a substantial retinue of armed clerics and German mercenaries, demanding admission to inspect the fortress's defences and review the military order's administrative records regarding taxation and recruitment activities within the surrounding district. Volkwin's response demonstrated both his military capabilities and his determination to resist episcopal interference in the order's internal affairs. The master refused admission to Albert's party, citing the brothers' constitutional autonomy as confirmed by papal privileges and imperial charters that granted them independent jurisdiction over their territorial holdings. The confrontation escalated when Albert's mercenaries attempted to force entry through the castle's main gate, resulting in armed skirmishes that left several men wounded on both sides before cooler heads prevailed to prevent full-scale combat between Christian forces. The incident created a diplomatic crisis that required intervention from external authorities to prevent civil war within the Crusader state. The papal response to this crisis, delivered through a series of bulls issued by Pope Gregory IX throughout 1230, attempted to establish clear jurisdictional boundaries between episcopal and military authorities while preserving the essential unity of the Crusader state. The papal solution divided governmental responsibilities according to functional categories, granting bishops primary authority over religious matters, taxation of clerical properties, and judicial proceedings involving canon law, while confirming military orders autonomous jurisdiction over fortifications, military recruitment, and defensive operations against pagan enemies. However, these papal directives left numerous areas of overlapping authority unresolved, particularly regarding the governance of mixed populations that included both German colonists and converted indigenous inhabitants. The Danish complications that emerged during this period of internal German discord threatened to fragment Terra Mariana along ethnic and political lines that could have destroyed the entire Crusader enterprise. King Valdemar II's territorial ambitions in northern Estonia had expanded significantly following his successful capture of Lindenice, with Danish forces establishing fortified positions throughout the coastal regions and asserting sovereign authority over territories that German forces considered integral to their own defensive perimeter. The Danish king's claims rested upon his independent participation in the Northern Crusades, arguing that territories conquered by Danish military efforts should remain under Danish rather than German political control. The legal complexities surrounding Danish territorial claims reflected the improvised nature of the alliance arrangements that had governed the initial conquest campaigns. The original agreements between Alba and Valdemar had established operational zones for coordinating military activities, but had not addressed the long-term political status of conquered territories or the relationship between Danish and German administrative systems. Valdemar's interpretation of these agreements emphasised his sovereign rights as an independent monarch participating in crusading activities, while German authorities argued that all conquered territories should be integrated into the unified administrative structure of Terra Mariana under ultimate papal and imperial authority. The specific territorial disputes between Danish and German forces centred on the commercially vital port cities that controlled access to lucrative trade routes connecting the Baltic region with Russian and Byzantine markets. Tallinn, constructed on the site of the former Estonian stronghold at Lindenice, had developed rapidly into one of the most important commercial centres in the northern Baltic due to its excellent natural harbour and strategic position along established shipping routes. Danish merchants, operating under royal protection and enjoying preferential trading privileges, had established dominant positions in several key commercial sectors, creating economic dependencies that reinforced Danish political claims to the surrounding territories. German responses to Danish territorial expansion reflected both military and diplomatic concerns about the long-term viability of the Crusader state if subjected to permanent partition along ethnic lines. The Brothers of the Sword, despite their internal disputes with episcopal authorities, recognised that Danish control over northern Estonian territories would create strategic vulnerabilities that could be exploited by future pagan or orthodox threats to the region. Military assessments prepared by the Order's strategic planners emphasised the defensive advantages of unified command over all Baltic territories, arguing that fragmented political control would inevitably lead to coordination failures during major military crises. The diplomatic negotiations that eventually resolved the Danish territorial dispute required extensive mediation by papal legates who possessed authority to interpret the religious obligations and privileges associated with crusading activities. Cardinal Otto of Tonengo, appointed as papal legate to the Baltic region in 1231, conducted detailed investigations of the legal and military arguments presented by all parties while gathering testimony from participants in the original conquest campaigns. His final arbitration, confirmed by papal bull in 1232, established a compromise solution that recognised Danish sovereignty over specific northern territories while integrating these regions into the broader defensive alliance structures necessary for protecting Christian populations against external threats. The Lithuanian raids that intensified during this period of internal German discord represented the most serious external military threat faced by Terra Mariana since the completion of the Estonian conquest campaigns. Lithuanian tribal confederations, organised under the leadership of experienced war chiefs who'd observed German military techniques during previous border conflicts, launched coordinated attacks against isolated settlements and supply convoys throughout the southern frontier regions. These raids differed significantly from the sporadic tribal warfare that had characterised earlier indigenous resistance, demonstrating sophisticated strategic planning and tactical coordination that suggested external military assistance or advice. The Lithuanian military organisation that emerged during the 1230s reflected significant adaptations to the challenges posed by German heavy cavalry and fortification systems. Lithuanian warriors, traditionally equipped with light weapons suitable for forest warfare, had acquired substantial quantities of iron-tipped spears, crossbows and other advanced military equipment through trade relationships with Orthodox Russian principalities and captured German supplies. Their tactical doctrine emphasised mobility and surprise, utilising intimate knowledge of forest paths and seasonal flooding patterns to approach German positions undetected, while maintaining rapid withdrawal capabilities that prevented effective pursuit by heavier German forces. The most devastating Lithuanian attack occurred in March 1233 when a force of approximately 600 warriors launched a coordinated assault against the German settlement at Bauska, located at a strategic river crossing that controlled access to several important agricultural districts. The attack commenced during pre-dawn hours when visibility limitations and reduced guard alertness provided optimal conditions for achieving tactical surprise. Lithuanian forces had conducted extensive reconnaissance operations that identified weaknesses in the settlement's defensive perimeter, including inadequately guarded sections of the wooden palisade and the location of ammunition storage areas that could be targeted with fire arrows. The assault on Bauska demonstrated the sophisticated siege techniques that Lithuanian forces had developed through observation of German military methods and adaptation to local defensive conditions. The attackers employed coordinated diversionary tactics that drew defenders' attention away from the main assault points, while specialised teams equipped with scaling ladders and grappling hooks approached the palisade walls under cover of concentrated archery fire. The settlement's garrison, comprising only 12 German knights with approximately 40 supporting infantry and militia forces, proved insufficient to defend the extensive perimeter against simultaneous attacks from multiple directions. The capture of Bauska provided Lithuanian forces with substantial quantities of military supplies, including weapons, armour, and siege equipment that significantly enhanced their capabilities for subsequent operations. More importantly, the psychological impact of this successful assault encouraged additional tribal groups to join the anti-German coalition, expanding the geographical scope of raiding activities throughout the southern frontier regions. German intelligence reports from this period indicate that Lithuanian war chiefs had established communication networks, extending into semi-Gallian and Curonian territories, suggesting the potential for coordinated uprising that could threaten the entire southern frontier of Terra Mariana. The German defensive response to the Lithuanian threat required significant modifications to established military doctrines and deployment patterns throughout the Crusader territories. The Brothers of the Sword, despite their ongoing disputes with episcopal authorities, recognised that external military threats demanded unified command structures and coordinated defensive planning that transcended internal political disagreements. Master Volkwin ordered the construction of additional fortified positions along the southern frontier, while implementing new patrol schedules and intelligence-gathering operations designed to provide early warning of Lithuanian raiding preparations. The fortification program initiated in response to the Lithuanian threat incorporated innovative defensive features adapted specifically to counter the mobility advantages enjoyed by indigenous raiding forces. German military engineers developed designs for smaller, more numerous strongpoints that could provide mutual support while covering larger territorial areas than traditional castle-based defensive systems. These installations, known as watchtowers, featured elevated observation platforms that provided visual surveillance over extensive forest areas, while underground storage chambers ensured that garrison forces could maintain resistance even during extended siege operations. The recruitment challenges that accompanied the expansion of defensive requirements revealed the limitations of the German colonial population in providing adequate military manpower for frontier defense. The total number of German knights available for military service throughout Terra Mariana remained below 200, while supporting infantry and militia forces numbered fewer than 1,500 men capable of sustained military operations. These numbers proved inadequate for simultaneously maintaining garrison forces in existing fortifications, conducting offensive operations against Lithuanian raiding bases, and providing escort services for commercial convoys and agricultural activities in threatened frontier regions. The solution to these manpower shortages required increased reliance on auxiliary forces recruited from converted indigenous populations, despite concerns about their reliability during conflicts with ethnically related enemies. German military commanders developed training programs designed to integrate Livonian and Estonian auxiliaries into combined arms formations that maximized their specialized knowledge of local terrain while placing them under direct German supervision. These auxiliary units proved particularly valuable for reconnaissance operations and pursuit missions that required mobility and endurance capabilities exceeding those of heavily armoured German knights. The internal governance disputes that persisted throughout this period of external military pressure created additional complications for effective military planning and resource allocation. The competing administrative systems maintained by episcopal and military authorities resulted in duplicated expenditures, conflicting recruitment policies, and inadequate coordination of defensive preparations. German colonists faced contradictory military service obligations from different authorities, while tax collection disputes reduced the financial resources available for fortification construction and military equipment procurement. The leadership succession crisis that developed within the Brothers of the Sword during 1234 threatened to paralyze the military order at the moment when external threats demanded maximum organizational effectiveness. Master Volkwin's death in a riding accident near Riga in January 1234 created a power vacuum that exposed fundamental disagreements within the order regarding military priorities, territorial expansion policies, and relationships with other German authorities. The election procedures established in the order's constitutional documents proved inadequate for resolving these disputes, as competing candidates possessed roughly equal support among the Knight brothers and represented fundamentally different approaches to the challenges facing the Crusader state. The two principal candidates for the mastership embodied contrasting strategic visions that reflected broader debates about the future direction of German expansion in the Baltic region. Konrad von Manden, a veteran of the Estonian campaigns who commanded strong support among the Order's military commanders, advocated aggressive expansion policies designed to eliminate remaining pagan threats through preemptive conquest of Lithuanian and Curonian territories. His strategic assessment emphasized the defensive advantages of controlling natural geographical boundaries, particularly the Neman River system, that could provide secure frontiers against future Orthodox Russian expansion from the east. The alternative candidate, Hermann von Buxhoeveden, nephew of Bishop Albert and representative of a more cautious approach to territorial expansion, argued for consolidation of existing conquests through intensive colonization and fortification programs before undertaking additional military campaigns. His strategic vision emphasized the development of economic and demographic foundations necessary for long-term survival of the German colonial enterprise, including expanded recruitment of German settlers, construction of additional urban centers, and establishment of manufacturing capabilities that could reduce dependence on imports from the Holy Roman Empire. The electoral deadlock that resulted from these competing visions paralysed the Order's decision-making processes during a critical period when Lithuanian raiding activities had intensified and Danish territorial disputes required immediate attention. The inability to select a new master created uncertainty about military command structures and strategic priorities that affected morale among both German knights and indigenous auxiliary forces. The crisis deepened when several prominent knight brothers threatened to transfer their allegiance to the Teutonic Knights, whose successful expansion in Prussia offered attractive alternatives for ambitious German warriors seeking advancement opportunities in frontier territories. The resolution of the mastership crisis came in February 1235 with the election of Volkwin von Naumburg, a compromise candidate whose military experience in the Holy Land and administrative competence in managing the Order's Estonian territories had earned respect from both factions within the Brothers of the Sword. Volkwin's election represented an attempt to bridge the strategic divisions that had paralysed the Order's leadership, combining elements of aggressive military expansion with systematic consolidation of existing territorial holdings. His first acts as master included reorganisation of the Order's command structure to eliminate redundancies that had developed during the succession crisis, while initiating comprehensive assessments of military capabilities and defensive requirements throughout Terra Mariana. The new master inherited a military organisation that had expanded significantly since the completion of the Estonian conquest campaigns, but remained stretched dangerously thin across extensive territorial holdings. The Order's total strength comprised approximately 120 knight brothers, supported by nearly 300 sergeants-at-arms and auxiliary personnel, while maintaining garrison responsibilities for over 30 fortified positions scattered throughout Livonia and Estonia. These numerical limitations became increasingly problematic as Lithuanian raiding activities intensified throughout the spring of 1235, requiring simultaneous defensive operations across multiple frontier sectors while maintaining adequate reserves for emergency response to major threats. The intelligence reports that reached Riga during the early months of 1235 indicated unprecedented coordination among Lithuanian tribal confederations under the leadership of a war chief named Mindaugas, whose political and military abilities had enabled him to unite previously fractious tribal groups into a coherent anti-German alliance. Mindaugas possessed extensive military experience gained through conflicts with Polish and Russian forces, while his diplomatic skills had secured military assistance and advanced weaponry from orthodox principalities that viewed German expansion as a threat to their own territorial interests in the Baltic region. The emergence of this unified Lithuanian leadership represented a qualitatively different challenge from the sporadic tribal warfare that had characterized earlier indigenous resistance efforts. The Lithuanian military preparations observed by German reconnaissance patrols during the spring and early summer of 1236 revealed sophisticated logistical planning and tactical coordination that suggested external military advisement from experienced commanders familiar with contemporary European warfare techniques. Lithuanian forces had established fortified camps at strategic locations throughout their territory, equipped with workshops for manufacturing weapons and siege equipment, using iron and other materials acquired through trade relationships with Russian and Polish merchants. These installations served as bases for training operations that familiarized tribal warriors with advanced military techniques, including coordinated cavalry charges, siege warfare, and combined arms tactics that integrated different weapon systems for maximum battlefield effectiveness. The German response to these intelligence reports reflected the strategic disagreements that continued to influence military planning despite Volkwin's election as master. Conservative elements within the Order's leadership advocated defensive strategies that emphasized fortification of existing positions, while avoiding offensive operations that might provoke major Lithuanian attacks, before German forces could be adequately reinforced. These commanders argued that the Order's limited manpower resources should be concentrated in secure positions where German technological advantages in armour and siege equipment could offset Lithuanian numerical superiority and mobility advantages in forest warfare. The alternative strategic approach, supported by younger knights eager to demonstrate their military prowess and secure additional territorial grants, emphasized preemptive offensive operations designed to disrupt Lithuanian military preparations before they could achieve full operational readiness. Proponents of this aggressive strategy argued that German military superiority depended upon maintaining tactical initiative through rapid offensive action, while defensive passivity would allow Lithuanian forces to choose the time and location of major engagements under conditions favourable to their own tactical preferences and capabilities. Master Volkwin's decision to pursue offensive operations against Lithuanian forces reflected both his personal military experience and his assessment of the broader strategic situation facing Terra Mariana. The Master recognised that prolonged defensive warfare would inevitably favour Lithuanian forces, whose superior knowledge of local terrain and larger population base provided significant advantages in sustained conflicts. His strategic calculation emphasised the importance of achieving decisive military victory before Lithuanian tribal confederations could complete their military preparations and potentially coordinate their operations with Russian or Polish forces that might exploit German preoccupation with southern frontier conflicts. The military intelligence available to German commanders provided detailed information about Lithuanian defensive positions and troop concentrations, gathered through reconnaissance operations conducted by converted Livonian auxiliaries who could move through Lithuanian territories without arousing suspicion. These intelligence reports identified the primary Lithuanian military concentration near Šiauliai, a strategic location that controlled important transportation routes, connecting different tribal territories while providing access to supply lines extending into Russian and Polish regions. The Lithuanian position occupied elevated terrain surrounded by extensive marshlands that channeled approaching forces into narrow corridors where defensive fire could achieve maximum effectiveness. The German force assembled for the offensive operation comprised virtually the entire available military strength of the Livonian Brothers of the Sword, including approximately 80 Knight Brothers, accompanied by their full complement of sergeants, men-at-arms, and auxiliary troops. This concentration represented the largest German military expedition assembled since the Estonian conquest campaigns, totaling nearly 800 combatants equipped with the most advanced military technology available in contemporary European warfare. The force included substantial numbers of crossbowmen armed with steel prod weapons capable of penetrating mail armour at considerable distances, while siege specialists brought portable engines designed for rapid deployment against fortified positions. The march towards Šiauliai commenced in early September 1236, following established military protocols that emphasized speed and tactical surprise, while maintaining adequate security against ambush attacks during movement through potentially hostile territory. The German column advanced along established routes that provided reliable sources of water and forage for the substantial number of warhorses accompanying the expedition, while reconnaissance patrols maintained continuous surveillance of the surrounding terrain to detect potential Lithuanian forces that might attempt to harass the advancing army. The logistical preparations for this expedition had required months of careful planning to accumulate adequate supplies of food, ammunition, and military equipment necessary for sustained operations in territory lacking established German supply bases. The tactical deployment adopted by German forces as they approached the Lithuanian position reflected established doctrines for conducting offensive operations against fortified positions defended by numerically superior indigenous forces. The German battle formation placed heavy cavalry in the centre, positioned for coordinated charge operations designed to break through Lithuanian defensive lines, while crossbowmen and other missile troops occupied flanking positions that could provide supporting fire during the main assault. The baggage train and siege equipment remained under heavy guard in the rear, protected by reserve forces that could respond to unexpected Lithuanian attacks while maintaining security for essential supplies and equipment. The Lithuanian defensive preparations observed by German scouts revealed sophisticated understanding of contemporary siege warfare techniques and careful adaptation to the specific tactical challenges posed by German heavy cavalry operations. Lithuanian engineers had constructed elaborate earthworks that channeled attacking forces into predetermined killing zones, where concentrated defensive fire could achieve maximum casualties, while obstacles, including sharpened stakes and concealed pits, prevented effective cavalry charges against the main defensive positions. The Lithuanian force, estimated at approximately 1,200 warriors, occupied carefully prepared positions that maximised their defensive advantages while minimising exposure to German siege engines and crossbow fire. The initial German assault commenced on September 22, 1236, following reconnaissance operations that had identified apparent weaknesses in the Lithuanian defensive perimeter. Master Volkwin personally led the main cavalry charge, accompanied by the Order's most experienced knights, in a formation designed to achieve rapid breakthrough of Lithuanian positions through concentrated application of superior German military technology and training. The charge began with coordinated crossbow volleys intended to suppress Lithuanian defensive fire, followed immediately by the thunderous advance of heavily armoured knights mounted on warhorses bred specifically for shock combat operations. The Lithuanian response to the German assault demonstrated tactical sophistication that exceeded German expectations based on previous encounters with indigenous forces. Rather than attempting to meet the German charge directly, Lithuanian commanders implemented a defensive strategy that allowed German cavalry to penetrate their forward positions before launching coordinated counterattacks from concealed positions on the flanks and rear. This tactical approach exploited the momentum of the German charge, while preventing the concentrated impact that made heavy cavalry so effective against static defensive formations. The marshy terrain surrounding the Lithuanian position proved far more treacherous than German reconnaissance had indicated, creating unexpected obstacles that disrupted the coordination of the cavalry charge and separated individual knights from their supporting formations. Horses struggled through soft ground that absorbed the impact of their advance, while riders found themselves isolated and vulnerable to concentrated Lithuanian attacks using spears, battle axes and other close combat weapons specifically designed for engaging heavily armoured opponents. The tactical advantages normally enjoyed by German heavy cavalry proved largely ineffective under these challenging terrain conditions. The death of Master Volkwin occurred during the height of the battle as he attempted to rally scattered German forces for a coordinated withdrawal from the deteriorating tactical situation. Lithuanian warriors, recognizing the distinctive heraldic devices that identified the German commander, concentrated their attacks against his position in an effort to eliminate German command control capabilities. Volkwin fell after sustaining multiple spear wounds that penetrated gaps in his armour, his death creating immediate confusion among German forces who lost tactical coordination without clear command authority to direct their movements. The collapse of German resistance following Volkwin's death resulted from the cumulative effects of tactical disadvantages, terrain difficulties, and leadership failures that had characterized the entire engagement. German knights trained for coordinated operations under centralized command found themselves unable to adapt effectively to the fluid tactical situation that developed as Lithuanian forces exploited their initial defensive success. The absence of clear succession procedures for battlefield command created additional confusion that prevented effective coordination of withdrawal operations. while Lithuanian forces pressed their tactical advantages through relentless pursuit of scattered German formations. The casualties sustained by the Brothers of the Sword during the Battle of Šiauliai represented a catastrophic loss of military capability that threatened the survival of the entire order as an effective fighting force. Approximately 50 Knight Brothers perished during the engagement, including virtually the entire senior leadership that had guided the Order's military operations since its foundation. The supporting forces suffered proportionally severe losses, with over 200 sergeants and men-at-arms killed or captured during the battle and subsequent pursuit operations. The military equipment lost during the disaster included substantial quantities of weapons, armour, and siege engines that represented years of accumulated resources essential for maintaining German military superiority in the region. The immediate aftermath of the Šiauliai disaster created a power vacuum throughout Terra Mariana that encouraged widespread uprisings among indigenous populations who had remained nominally subject to German authority since the conquest campaigns. Semi-Gallian tribes, led by chieftains who had maintained clandestine communication with Lithuanian resistance leaders, launched coordinated attacks against isolated German settlements and fortifications throughout the southern frontier regions. These uprisings differed significantly from previous resistance efforts in their scope and coordination, reflecting careful planning that had anticipated the opportunity created by German military weakness following the battlefield disaster. The Livonian uprising that erupted simultaneously with the Semi-Gallian rebellion demonstrated the persistent resentment among indigenous populations toward German colonial rule, despite decades of apparent accommodation to Christian authority. Livonian villages that had provided auxiliary troops for German military operations suddenly turned against their former allies, attacking supply convoys and communication lines that connected different German strongholds. The rebels possessed intimate knowledge of German defensive preparations and tactical procedures gained through their service as auxiliary forces, enabling them to exploit specific vulnerabilities in fortification systems and garrison deployment patterns. The siege of Venden Castle, the Order's principal stronghold in the Livonian heartland, commenced within days of news reaching the indigenous population about the German defeat at Šiauliai. The attacking force comprised approximately 400 Livonian and semi-Gallian warriors, equipped with siege equipment captured from German supply convoys and abandoned fortifications. The rebels demonstrated sophisticated understanding of siege warfare techniques, constructing elaborate earthworks that protected their positions while providing platforms for siege engines capable of launching projectiles against the castle's stone walls. The garrison, reduced to fewer than 30 German defenders following the departure of forces for the Lithuanian campaign, faced overwhelming odds in defending the extensive fortification complex. The psychological impact of the Šiauliai defeat extended far beyond the immediate military consequences, undermining the prestige and authority that had enabled German forces to maintain control over indigenous populations despite their numerical disadvantages. The destruction of German military power demonstrated the vulnerability of the colonial system to coordinated indigenous resistance, encouraging additional tribal groups to join the rebellion, while discouraging collaboration among populations that had previously cooperated with German authorities. The myth of German military invincibility, carefully cultivated through decades of successful conquest campaigns, collapsed entirely as news of the disaster spread throughout the Baltic region. The financial crisis that accompanied the military disaster reflected the Order's dependence on territorial revenues and military spoils for maintaining their operations and infrastructure. The loss of tax collection capabilities in rebellious territories eliminated essential sources of income, while the destruction of military equipment and supplies created enormous replacement costs that exceeded the Order's available financial resources. The economic disruption extended to German colonial settlements whose agricultural and commercial activities faced constant threat from raiding operations that made normal economic activities impossible in many regions. The recruitment crisis that followed the Šiauliai catastrophe revealed the fundamental weakness of the German colonial enterprise in the Baltic region, where military effectiveness depended upon a relatively small number of professional knights whose replacement required extensive training and substantial financial investment. The Order's efforts to recruit replacement personnel from the Holy Roman Empire encountered significant obstacles, including competition from other military orders operating in Prussia and the Holy Land, while the deteriorating military situation in Livonia discouraged potential recruits who might otherwise have been attracted by opportunities for territorial advancement and military glory. The diplomatic efforts undertaken by surviving German authorities to secure external military assistance reflected the desperate nature of their situation following the collapse of their independent military capabilities. Bishop Albert, despite his advanced age and previous conflicts with the military order, assumed leadership of the effort to preserve German authority in the region through appeals to papal and imperial authorities for immediate military intervention. His correspondence with the papal curia emphasized the religious significance of preserving Christian territories against pagan resurgence, while letters to the imperial court stressed the strategic importance of maintaining German influence in the Baltic region against potential Russian expansion. The negotiations with the Teutonic Knights that ultimately resolved the crisis of the Livonian Brothers of the Sword required extensive diplomatic coordination between multiple authorities, including papal legates, imperial representatives, and the leadership of various military orders operating throughout the crusading territories. The Teutonic Knights, whose successful expansion in Prussia had established them as the dominant German military organisation in the Eastern Baltic, possessed both the military capabilities and institutional resources necessary to restore German authority in Livonia and Estonia. However, the intervention required careful negotiation of jurisdictional arrangements that would preserve their institutional autonomy while integrating Livonian territories into their broader strategic planning for the region. The formal incorporation of surviving members of the Livonian Brothers of the Sword into the Teutonic Order in 1237 marked the end of their independent existence as a military organisation, though their territorial conquests and institutional legacy would continue to influence the development of German colonial society in the Baltic region for centuries. The merger agreement preserved the rights and properties of surviving Knight Brothers while placing them under the disciplined command structure that had enabled the Teutonic Knights to achieve unprecedented success in their Prussian campaigns. This institutional transformation provided the military leadership and organisational capabilities necessary for suppressing the indigenous uprisings and restoring German control over the rebellious territories. The negotiations between the surviving remnants of the Livonian Brothers of the Sword and the Teutonic Order began in earnest during the winter months of 1236 to 1237, conducted through papal intermediaries who possessed the ecclesiastical authority necessary to facilitate the complex legal arrangements required for such an unprecedented merger. Pope Gregory IX, recognising the existential threat posed to Christian territories in the Baltic following the Šiauliai catastrophe, issued a series of bulls that provided the canonical framework for incorporating the decimated Livonian order into the larger and more successful Teutonic organisation. The papal bull Petati Proximum, dated January 14, 1237, formally authorised the merger while establishing specific conditions designed to preserve the territorial rights and religious obligations that had characterised the original Livonian mission. The legal complexities surrounding this institutional transformation required extensive consultation with canon law experts and imperial jurists who possessed expertise in the constitutional arrangements governing military orders throughout the crusading territories. The fundamental challenge involved reconciling the autonomous privileges originally granted to the Livonian brothers with the centralized command structure that had enabled the Teutonic Knights to achieve remarkable success in their Prussian campaigns. The Teutonic Order's Grand Master, Hermann von Salza, insisted upon maintaining unified command authority over all military operations while agreeing to preserve certain distinctive characteristics of the Livonian territories that reflected their unique historical development and geographical circumstances. The territorial arrangements negotiated during these discussions established the Livonian branch of the Teutonic Order as a semi-autonomous administrative unit within the broader organisational structure of the parent order. This compromise solution recognised the practical necessity of adapting Teutonic administrative procedures to the specific conditions prevailing in Livonia and Estonia, where decades of German colonial development had created institutional patterns that differed significantly from those established in Prussia. The Livonian territories would retain their existing legal codes, commercial privileges, and ecclesiastical arrangements while accepting integration into the Teutonic military hierarchy and strategic planning processes. Hermann von Salza's strategic assessment of the Livonian situation emphasized the urgent necessity of restoring German military credibility through decisive action against the indigenous uprisings that had erupted following the Šiauliai disaster. The Grand Master recognized that prolonged weakness in the northern Baltic territories would encourage additional resistance movements, while potentially attracting intervention from Orthodox Russian principalities seeking to exploit German difficulties for their own territorial advantage. His military planning called for immediate deployment of substantial Teutonic forces to suppress the rebellions and demonstrate the restored strength of German military power in the region. The first contingent of Teutonic reinforcements arrived in Riga during February 1237, comprising approximately 60 Knight Brothers, accompanied by their full complement of supporting personnel and military equipment. These forces represented some of the most experienced warriors in the Teutonic Order, veterans of the successful Prussian campaigns who possessed expertise in the specialized techniques required for frontier warfare against indigenous populations. Their commander, Dietrich von Gruningen, had distinguished himself during the conquest of Prussian territories and brought with him detailed knowledge of the tactical innovations that had enabled Teutonic forces to overcome similar challenges in their previous campaigns. The organisational restructuring that accompanied the merger involved systematic integration of surviving Livonian personnel into established Teutonic command hierarchies, while preserving institutional knowledge about local conditions and indigenous populations that remained essential for effective military operations. The 23 surviving Knight Brothers of the Livonian Order retained their status within the merged organisation, though they accepted subordination to Teutonic commanders who possessed superior experience in coordinated military operations. This arrangement ensured continuity of local expertise, while introducing the disciplined leadership that had been lacking during the crisis preceding the Šiauliai catastrophe. The administrative systems implemented throughout the Livonian territories reflected Teutonic organisational principles that emphasised centralised record-keeping, standardised procedures, and efficient resource allocation. The new administration established comprehensive registries documenting population levels, agricultural production, commercial activities, and military obligations throughout all German-controlled territories. These records provided essential information for strategic planning, while enabling more effective taxation and recruitment procedures that could support expanded military operations against remaining indigenous threats. The military hierarchy established in the reorganised Livonian territories placed a Landmeister at the apex of regional command, responsible for all military and administrative decisions within the territory while maintaining direct communication with the Grand Master in Prussia regarding strategic coordination and resource allocation. The first Landmeister of Livonia, Andreas von Felben, possessed extensive experience in both military operations and territorial administration, gained during the Teutonic conquest of Prussia. His appointment represented the Teutonic Order's commitment to applying proven leadership techniques to the challenges of restoring stability in the northern Baltic territories. The fortress system that emerged under Teutonic administration incorporated architectural innovations developed during the Prussian campaigns, adapted to the specific defensive requirements imposed by Livonian geographical conditions and indigenous military capabilities. The reconstruction of Venden Castle, severely damaged during the siege that followed the Šiauliai defeat, exemplified these architectural adaptations. Teutonic engineers redesigned the fortification to incorporate multiple defensive perimeters, underground passages connecting different sections of the complex, and specialized facilities for manufacturing and maintaining military equipment. The resulting structure combined the massive stone construction characteristic of Teutonic fortifications with defensive features specifically designed to counter the guerrilla tactics employed by indigenous resistance forces. The recruitment policies implemented by the reorganized military order addressed the critical manpower shortages that had contributed to the earlier military disasters through systematic expansion of auxiliary forces drawn from converted indigenous populations. Teutonic commanders recognized that effective control of the extensive Livonian territories required military forces capable of operating effectively in forest environments where traditional German cavalry tactics proved inadequate. The integration of Livonian and Estonian auxiliaries into combined arms formations provided essential capabilities while reducing the burden on German Knight brothers, who remained responsible for maintaining overall military leadership and coordination. The training programs developed for these auxiliary forces reflected Teutonic expertise in creating effective military units from different ethnic and cultural backgrounds. Indigenous recruits received instruction in German military techniques, including formation fighting, siege warfare, and cavalry support operations, while retaining their specialized knowledge of local terrain and traditional hunting and tracking skills. The resulting military units combined the technological advantages of German military equipment with the mobility and environmental expertise essential for successful operations against indigenous resistance movements. The economic reorganization that accompanied the military restructuring involved systematic development of commercial and agricultural activities designed to generate revenues necessary for supporting expanded military operations. Teutonic administrators implemented comprehensive surveys of agricultural potential throughout the conquered territories, identifying opportunities for expanded cultivation that could support larger German populations while generating tax revenues essential for military expenditures. The Order's experience in developing similar economic systems in Prussia provided valuable precedents for maximizing the productive capacity of frontier territories. The commercial privileges granted to German merchants operating in Livonian territories reflected Teutonic understanding of the relationship between economic development and military security in frontier regions. The reorganized administration offered favorable terms to Hanseatic merchants willing to establish permanent trading operations in Riga and other Livonian cities, while providing military protection for commercial activities that generated essential tax revenues. These policies attracted substantial investment from German commercial interests, creating economic incentives for continued German presence in the region, while reducing dependence on external financial support for military operations. The religious administration established under Teutonic authority maintained the existing episcopal structure while introducing enhanced coordination between military and ecclesiastical authorities that had been lacking during the previous period of institutional conflict. The appointment of new bishops and abbots required approval from both papal authorities and Teutonic leadership, ensuring compatibility between religious and military objectives while preserving the canonical independence necessary for effective pastoral care among both German and indigenous populations. The conversion policies implemented by the reorganized administration reflected Teutonic experience in managing religiously diverse populations through a combination of coercion and incentive that had proven effective in Prussia. Indigenous populations faced systematic pressure to demonstrate genuine commitment to Christian practices through participation in religious ceremonies, financial contributions to church construction projects, and cooperation with German authorities in suppressing remaining pagan religious activities. However, these requirements were balanced by economic opportunities and legal protections that provided tangible benefits for compliance with German religious and political authority. The military campaigns launched during the spring of 1237 to suppress the indigenous uprisings demonstrated the restored effectiveness of German military power under disciplined Teutonic leadership. The systematic approach adopted by Landmeister Andreas involved coordinated operations against multiple rebel strongholds, preventing the concentration of indigenous forces while maximising the impact of German technological advantages in siege warfare and heavy cavalry operations. The campaign against the semi-Gallian rebels near Bauska exemplified these tactical innovations, combining traditional German military strengths with adaptive techniques developed specifically for forest warfare conditions. The siege operations conducted against rebel fortifications incorporated engineering techniques that reflected Teutonic expertise in overcoming indigenous defensive systems through systematic application of superior technology and organisational capabilities. German forces constructed elaborate siege works that isolated rebel positions from external support while providing protected positions for siege engines capable of breaching wooden palisades and earthwork fortifications. The coordination of these operations required sophisticated logistical planning that ensured adequate supplies of ammunition, food, and military equipment for sustained operations in hostile territory. The psychological warfare employed during these suppression campaigns included deliberate demonstrations of German military capabilities designed to discourage continued resistance among indigenous populations who'd participated in the uprisings. Public executions of captured rebel leaders served as warnings about the consequences of opposing German authority, while offers of amnesty for ordinary participants provided opportunities for reconciliation that could prevent future resistance activities. These policies reflected Teutonic understanding of the importance of combining military effectiveness with political accommodation in achieving long-term stability in conquered territories. The territorial consolidation achieved through these military campaigns restored German control over strategic locations that had been lost during the chaos following the Šiauliai disaster. The recapture of important river crossings, commercial routes, and agricultural districts eliminated the geographical fragmentation that had weakened German defensive capabilities while providing secure bases for future expansion operations against remaining indigenous threats. The systematic nature of these operations demonstrated the organisational advantages that had enabled the Teutonic Order to achieve unprecedented success in their previous conquest campaigns. The administrative integration that followed military success involved careful documentation of population levels, property ownership, and economic activities throughout the recovered territories. Teutonic administrators conducted comprehensive surveys that identified opportunities for expanded German settlement while assessing the loyalty and capabilities of indigenous populations who had remained under German authority during the uprising period. This information provided essential foundations for long-term planning regarding military deployment, taxation policies, and recruitment procedures necessary for maintaining stable control over the extensive territorial holdings. The diplomatic coordination that characterized Teutonic administration extended beyond military matters to include systematic communication with papal authorities, imperial representatives, and other German military orders operating throughout the crusading territories. This diplomatic network provided access to external resources and expertise, while ensuring coordination of strategic planning that could prevent conflicts between different German authorities operating in the Baltic region. The institutional maturity demonstrated through these diplomatic activities reflected the organisational sophistication that distinguished the Teutonic Order from earlier military organisations that had operated in the region. The restoration of military capabilities under Teutonic guidance represented a systematic transformation that extended far beyond simple recruitment of replacement personnel. Landmeister Andreas von Felben implemented comprehensive reforms that addressed the fundamental organizational weaknesses that had contributed to the Scholei catastrophe, drawing upon proven Teutonic methods developed during the successful Prussian campaigns. The military hierarchy established in Livonia incorporated standardized training procedures, disciplined command structures, and sophisticated logistical systems that had enabled the parent order to achieve unprecedented success in frontier warfare against indigenous populations. The recruitment campaigns launched throughout the Holy Roman Empire during 1238 to 1240 attracted substantial numbers of experienced knights seeking advancement opportunities in the expanding Baltic territories. Unlike the earlier recruitment efforts of the original Livonian brothers, these campaigns benefited from the established reputation and extensive network connections of the Teutonic Order, whose successful expansion had created attractive prospects for territorial grants and military advancement. The recruitment process emphasized selection of knights with proven combat experience and demonstrated ability to adapt to frontier conditions, avoiding the inexperienced younger sons who had comprised significant portions of earlier German colonial expeditions. The new arrivals included veterans of campaigns in Prussia, the Holy Land, and various conflicts throughout the German territories, bringing with them specialized knowledge of siege warfare, cavalry tactics, and administrative procedures that had proven effective in similar frontier environments. Among the most significant additions was Konrad von Tierberg, a former Templar commander who possessed extensive experience in coordinated military operations against Muslim forces in the Eastern Mediterranean. His expertise in siege engineering and fortification design would prove crucial in developing the defensive systems that secured Livonian territories against external threats throughout the remainder of the 13th century. The military training programs established under Teutonic administration incorporated innovations developed through decades of frontier warfare, emphasizing adaptability and tactical flexibility rather than rigid adherence to traditional knightly combat methods. Knights received instruction in forest warfare techniques, including dismounted combat operations, coordination with auxiliary forces, and specialized equipment designed for operations in the dense woodlands and marshy terrain characteristic of the Baltic region. The training regimen also emphasized maintenance and repair of military equipment under field conditions, recognizing the logistical challenges involved in maintaining sophisticated weaponry and armor in territories lacking established manufacturing capabilities. The integration of auxiliary forces recruited from indigenous populations required careful attention to reliability concerns, while maximizing their specialized capabilities in forest warfare and reconnaissance operations. Teutonic commanders developed systematic procedures for evaluating the loyalty and combat effectiveness of potential recruits, establishing probationary periods during which indigenous warriors served under direct German supervision before receiving full integration into military formations. The most reliable auxiliaries received advanced training in German military techniques, including operation of siege engines, maintenance of cavalry equipment, and coordination procedures for combined arms operations. The weapons and equipment provided to these expanded military forces reflected Teutonic emphasis on standardization and quality control that had proven essential for maintaining military effectiveness during extended campaigns. The Order's workshops in Prussia produced standardized designs for swords, spears, crossbows, and armor that incorporated improvements developed through practical experience in frontier warfare. The establishment of similar manufacturing facilities in Livonia reduced dependence on imports while providing employment opportunities for German craftsmen willing to relocate to the Baltic territories. The fortification program initiated during this period of military restoration incorporated architectural innovations that address specific defensive requirements identified through analysis of the previous military disasters. The reconstruction of major strongholds, including Venden, Kessis and Kokenhausen, involved comprehensive redesign of defensive systems to provide multiple fallback positions, secure communication routes between different sections of fortifications, and specialized facilities for manufacturing and storing military supplies during siege operations. The new designs emphasize coordination between different defensive positions, enabling mutual support that could prevent the isolation and defeat of individual strongholds. The successful campaigns against semi-Gallian resistance that characterized the period from 1240 to 1260 demonstrated the restored effectiveness of German military power under disciplined Teutonic leadership. The semi-Gallian tribes, emboldened by their successes during the uprising that followed Šiauliai, had established fortified positions throughout the Lielupe River Valley and maintained active resistance against German authority through guerrilla warfare and raids against colonial settlements. Their military organisation under chieftains such as Viestads and Nemesis had evolved significantly since the earlier conquest period, incorporating captured German military equipment and tactical knowledge gained through observation of German military methods. The systematic approach adopted by Landmeister Andreas for suppressing semi-Gallian resistance involved coordinated operations designed to eliminate rebel strongholds while preventing concentration of indigenous forces that might achieve tactical advantages through superior numbers and knowledge of local terrain. The campaign commenced with extensive reconnaissance operations conducted by converted Livonian auxiliaries who possessed the linguistic skills and cultural knowledge necessary for gathering intelligence about semi-Gallian military preparations and defensive positions. This intelligence revealed the existence of sophisticated communication networks connecting different tribal groups, suggesting coordination that exceeded previous levels of indigenous military organization. The Siege of Terveta, the principal semi-Gallian stronghold, commenced in the summer of 1245 following careful preparation that included construction of elaborate siege works and accumulation of substantial supplies for sustained operations. The fortress occupied a naturally strong position on elevated ground surrounded by extensive marshlands, with defensive earthworks and wooden palisades that incorporated lessons learned from observing German siege techniques during previous conflicts. The semi-Gallian garrison, estimated at over 400 warriors, possessed adequate supplies for prolonged resistance, while maintaining communication with external tribal groups who might provide relief forces. The German assault forces comprised approximately 120 knights, supported by 300 auxiliary troops and specialized siege personnel equipped with advanced military technology, including torsion engines, counterweight trebuchets, and mobile protective screens that enabled approach operations against defended positions. The siege operations demonstrated systematic application of engineering techniques developed during the Teutonic conquest of Prussia, adapted to the specific challenges posed by semi-Gallian defensive systems and the marshy terrain surrounding the fortress. The construction of causeways across the surrounding wetlands required extensive use of timber and stone transported from distant quarries, representing a substantial logistical undertaking that demonstrated German organizational capabilities. The breakthrough at Terveta occurred after 47 days of siege operations, when German engineers succeeded in undermining a section of the fortress's main defensive wall through systematic excavation operations conducted under protection of mobile siege towers. The collapse of this defensive barrier created a breach approximately 12 meters wide that allowed German assault forces to penetrate the fortress compound despite fierce semi-Gallian resistance. The subsequent fighting within the fortress demonstrated the exceptional courage and military skill of indigenous defenders who maintained organized resistance even after their primary defensive positions had been compromised. The capture of Terveta eliminated the principal center of semi-Gallian military resistance, while providing German forces with substantial quantities of captured weapons, supplies and intelligence. about remaining rebel strongholds throughout the region. The psychological impact of this victory encouraged submission among several minor semi-Gallian chieftains, who recognised the futility of continued resistance against restored German military capabilities. However, the most determined resistance leaders, including Nemesius, withdrew with their remaining forces into remote forest areas where they continued guerrilla operations against German supply lines and isolated outposts. The final subjugation of semi-Gallian resistance required additional campaigns conducted throughout the 1250s and 1260s, characterised by systematic elimination of rebel bases and forced relocation of indigenous populations away from strategically important territories. The German approach emphasised destruction of economic resources that sustained resistance activities, including burning of grain stores, destruction of livestock, and elimination of forest camps where rebel forces maintained their equipment and supplies. These operations achieved their strategic objectives of ending organised resistance while creating humanitarian crises among displaced populations that generated lasting resentment toward German authority. The Curonian campaigns that followed the suppression of semi-Gallian resistance represented the final phase of German territorial expansion in the Baltic region during this period. The Curonian tribes occupied strategic territories along the Baltic coast that controlled access to important commercial routes, while maintaining diplomatic relationships with Scandinavian kingdoms that complicated German expansion efforts. Their military organisation, influenced by maritime traditions and trade relationships with various Baltic peoples, differed significantly from the forest-based warfare characteristic of other indigenous groups in the region. The German conquest of Curonian territories required coordination with Danish naval forces that controlled access to coastal areas while preventing external assistance from reaching indigenous defenders. The siege of Kuldega, the principal Curonian stronghold, involved combined land and naval operations that demonstrated sophisticated coordination between different German military organisations operating in the Baltic region. The fortress occupied a commanding position overlooking the Venta River, with defensive systems that incorporated both traditional earthwork fortifications and stone construction techniques acquired through contact with Scandinavian builders. The development of castle networks throughout the conquered territories served multiple functions in securing German control while providing bases for continued expansion operations. The construction program initiated during the 1250s involved establishment of approximately 30 major fortifications connected by road networks and communication systems that enabled rapid response to military threats, while facilitating administration of the extensive territorial holdings. The castle designs incorporated standardized architectural features that reflected Teutonic engineering expertise, while adapting to specific geographical conditions and defensive requirements imposed by local threats. Bauska Castle, constructed at the confluence of the Musa and Memelo rivers, exemplified the sophisticated fortification systems developed during this period. The structure incorporated massive stone walls rising directly from rocky foundations, with towers positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire across all approaches while maintaining secure communication routes to neighbouring strongholds. The interior facilities included extensive barracks, workshops, stables and storage areas necessary for independent operation during extended siege operations, while administrative quarters provided accommodation for the German officials responsible for governing the surrounding territories. The fortified settlements that accompanied castle construction represented systematic efforts to establish permanent German populations throughout the conquered territories while providing secure bases for commercial and agricultural activities. These settlements, known as burgs, incorporated defensive features including wooden palisades, ditches and guard towers, while maintaining urban layouts that facilitated commercial activities and administrative functions. The largest of these settlements, including Valmiera, Kessis and Jelgava, developed into important regional centres that attracted German merchants, craftsmen, and agricultural colonists seeking opportunities for economic advancement in frontier territories. The establishment of trade relationships with the Hanseatic League during the 1260s and 1270s transformed the economic foundations of the German colonial enterprise, while providing essential resources for continued military operations and territorial expansion. The Hanseatic merchants, operating from established bases in Lübeck, Hamburg and other German cities, possessed the commercial networks and financial resources necessary for developing large-scale trade operations in Baltic commodities including timber, amber, furs and agricultural products. Their investment in Livonian commercial activities created economic incentives for peaceful development while generating tax revenues essential for supporting military garrisons and administrative systems. Riga's development as a major commercial centre reflected systematic planning that integrated military, religious and economic functions within a unified urban structure. The city's expansion during this period included construction of substantial warehouses, workshops, and residential areas that accommodated growing populations of German merchants, craftsmen, and administrative personnel. The harbour facilities were enlarged and improved to accommodate the largest vessels operating in Baltic trade, while defensive systems were enhanced to protect the valuable commercial activities from potential military threats. The commercial privileges granted to Hanseatic merchants included favourable taxation rates, legal protections for their business activities, and exclusive rights to certain categories of trade that generated substantial profits while encouraging continued investment in Livonian commercial development. These arrangements created mutually beneficial relationships between military and commercial interests that strengthened German presence in the region, while providing economic foundations for long-term stability and growth. The resulting commercial prosperity attracted additional German settlers, while generating resources necessary for continued territorial expansion and military operations. The economic development that accompanied commercial expansion included establishment of manufacturing activities that reduced dependence on imports, while creating employment opportunities for both German and indigenous populations. Iron production, utilising local ore deposits and advanced smelting techniques introduced by German craftsmen, provided essential materials for weapons, tools and construction projects, while generating export revenues through trade with other Baltic regions. Textile production, leatherworking and various specialised crafts developed to serve both local needs and export markets accessible through Hanseatic commercial networks. The agricultural development that supported this economic expansion involved systematic colonisation of fertile territories by German settlers, who introduced advanced farming techniques and crop varieties that increased overall productivity. The colonial settlements established during this period incorporated planned layouts that maximised agricultural efficiency while providing defensive capabilities against potential threats from remaining indigenous resistance groups. The three-field system and other agricultural innovations increased grain production substantially, creating surpluses that could support larger urban populations while generating export revenues through grain trade with other European regions. The integration of indigenous populations into this expanding economic system required careful balance between coercion and incentive that would encourage productive participation while preventing the development of resistance movements that might threaten German authority. Indigenous communities that demonstrated loyalty to German rule received access to improved agricultural techniques, participation in commercial activities, and legal protections that provided tangible benefits for cooperation with colonial authorities. However, communities that maintained resistance activities faced systematic economic pressure, including restriction of trade opportunities, confiscation of agricultural surpluses, and forced relocation away from economically valuable territories. The administrative systems developed to manage this complex economic and social transformation incorporated sophisticated record-keeping procedures and legal frameworks that addressed the diverse needs of German and indigenous populations, while maintaining overall coherence and effectiveness. The legal codes established during this period combined elements of German customary law, canon law, and practical accommodations to local conditions that created hybrid systems capable of addressing disputes and maintaining order among populations. The administrative hierarchy extended from the Landmeister through regional commanders to local officials responsible for implementing policies and maintaining security in specific territorial districts. The administrative structures that had emerged under Teutonic guidance by 1290 created the foundation for a unique political entity that would evolve into the Livonian Confederation, a complex arrangement of competing authorities that maintained nominal unity while pursuing often conflicting interests. The death of Landmeister Konrad von Feuchtwangen in 1290 marked a crucial transition point, as his successors faced mounting pressure from various ecclesiastical and secular authorities who sought greater autonomy from direct Teutonic control. The confederation that emerged represented not a planned political structure, but rather a pragmatic accommodation to the realities of governing diverse territories with limited resources and competing claims to authority. The ecclesiastical hierarchy that had developed alongside military conquest maintained substantial independent power through direct papal appointments and extensive landholdings that generated revenues independent of Teutonic administration. Archbishop Johannes von Loon of Riga, appointed in 1294, possessed both the political acumen and canonical authority necessary to challenge Teutonic dominance over territorial governance. His archbishopric controlled approximately one-third of all conquered territories, including some of the most economically productive agricultural districts and several strategically important commercial centres along the Daugava River. The archbishop's authority extended beyond purely religious matters to include judicial functions, taxation rights, and military obligations that created parallel governmental structures competing with Teutonic administration. The bishops of Dorpat, Osselvik, and Kurland maintained similar autonomous authorities within their respective dioceses, creating a fragmented ecclesiastical landscape that complicated unified governance, while providing alternative sources of authority for populations dissatisfied with Teutonic rule. Bishop Hermann von Buxhoevden of Dorpat, nephew of the original Bishop Albert, inherited extensive territorial holdings that included several major fortifications and numerous agricultural estates worked by both German colonists and indigenous populations. His administrative capabilities and family connections to the original conquest generation provided him with political influence that extended far beyond his canonical jurisdiction. The emergence of urban autonomy represented another significant challenge to centralized Teutonic authority, as commercial centers developed independent political institutions modelled on successful German city-states. Riga's merchant community, enriched through Hanseatic trade relationships and local commercial privileges, began asserting municipal rights that included self-governance, independent taxation, and autonomous judicial systems for commercial disputes. The city council that emerged during the 1290s comprised wealthy German merchants whose economic interests often conflicted with Teutonic military priorities and ecclesiastical taxation demands. The council's composition reflected the commercial elite that had accumulated substantial wealth through Baltic trade operations, including families such as the Kalkbergs, Mengdens and Uexkulls, whose merchant activities extended throughout northern Europe. These families possessed both the financial resources and political connections necessary to challenge Teutonic authority, while maintaining profitable relationships with Hanseatic partners who provided external support for urban autonomy movements. Their economic power enabled them to finance independent military forces, construct autonomous fortifications, and negotiate directly with foreign merchants without Teutonic oversight. Reval, established on the site of the former Estonian stronghold at Lindanis, developed similar autonomous institutions under Danish influence that persisted even after formal integration into the Livonian territories. The city's strategic position, controlling access to important trade routes connecting Novgorod with Western European markets, generated substantial commercial revenues that supported independent political development. The merchant families that dominated Reval's governance maintained cultural and economic connections with Danish and Swedish commercial networks that provided alternatives to German-controlled trade relationships. The competition between these various authorities created a complex political environment where no single institution possessed sufficient power to dominate the others completely. The Teutonic Landmeister retained ultimate military authority and controlled the largest territorial holdings, but his effectiveness depended upon cooperation from ecclesiastical authorities who controlled essential resources and urban centres that provided crucial commercial revenues. This balance of power created opportunities for skilled political operators to advance their interests through careful navigation of competing jurisdictions and alliance systems. The legal framework that emerged to govern this complex political arrangement incorporated elements from multiple sources including Teutonic constitutional law, canonical regulations, German municipal codes, and practical accommodations to local conditions and customs. The Livonian legal code that developed during the early 14th century represented a synthesis of these various influences, creating hybrid institutions that could address disputes between different authorities while maintaining overall systemic coherence. The code established procedures for resolving jurisdictional conflicts, coordinating military operations, and managing shared resources such as major fortifications and transportation networks. The military obligations that bound these various authorities together provided the essential framework for maintaining unified defence capabilities despite political fragmentation. Each authority maintained its own military forces appropriate to its territorial holdings and strategic responsibilities, but major external threats required coordinated response that necessitated temporary subordination of competing interests to collective security requirements. The system of military service obligations established during this period specified the contributions expected from each authority during different categories of military emergency, from local raids requiring limited response to major invasions, demanding full mobilization of all available resources. The Russian expansion that characterized the late 13th and early 14th centuries created the external pressure necessary to maintain Confederation unity despite internal political tensions. The Principality of Novgorod, under Prince Dmitry Alexandrovich, had recovered from earlier defeats and begun systematic expansion westward into territories that bordered Livonian holdings. Novgorod's military capabilities had improved significantly through adoption of advanced siege techniques and recruitment of experienced military commanders from other Russian principalities engaged in conflicts with Mongol forces. Their expansion threatened crucial trade routes and agricultural territories that provided essential resources for all Livonian authorities. The Novgorodian military organization that confronted the Livonian Confederation incorporated both traditional Russian military elements and innovations adapted from conflicts with various enemies, including Mongol forces, Lithuanian tribal confederations, and previous German expansion efforts. Novgorodian armies comprised substantial numbers of professional warriors, equipped with advanced weaponry and supported by sophisticated logistical systems that enabled sustained operations far from their territorial base. Their siege capabilities included advanced engineering techniques and specialized equipment capable of breaching the stone fortifications that protected major Livonian strongholds. The Battle of Rakvere in 1302 demonstrated both the military effectiveness of coordinated Livonian defense and the persistent challenges posed by Russian expansion efforts. The Novgorodian force that approached the fortress comprised approximately 1,500 warriors, including heavy cavalry, infantry formations, and siege specialists equipped with advanced military technology. Their commander, Prince Dmitry, possessed extensive military experience gained through conflicts with various enemies and had developed tactical innovations specifically designed to counter German military advantages in heavy cavalry and fortification systems. The Livonian defence force assembled to meet this threat included contingents from all major authorities within the Confederation, totalling nearly 1,000 combatants representing the largest coordinated military effort since the Teutonic reorganisation. Landmeister Gottfried von Rogge commanded the overall defence, supported by contingents led by Archbishop Johannes, Bishop Hermann, and representatives of the major urban centres. The coordination required for assembling this force demonstrated both the military capabilities available to the Confederation and the political mechanisms that enabled cooperation despite ongoing jurisdictional disputes. The siege operations that developed around Rakvere revealed sophisticated Russian understanding of contemporary siege warfare techniques, adapted to the specific challenges posed by Teutonic fortification systems. Novgorodian engineers constructed elaborate siege works that incorporated multiple approaches to the fortress walls while providing protected positions for siege engines capable of launching heavy projectiles against stone fortifications. Their tactical approach emphasized systematic reduction of defensive capabilities through concentrated bombardment, while maintaining sufficient forces to repel relief attempts from external Livonian forces. The fortress garrison, commanded by Komtur Heinrich von Dinkelage, comprised 60 German knights supported by 200 auxiliary troops and civilian defenders who possessed adequate supplies for extended resistance. The defensive preparations included construction of additional internal barriers that could provide fallback positions if external walls were breached, while communication systems enabled coordination with relief forces approaching from other Livonian strongholds. The fortress's strategic position controlling important transportation routes made its retention essential for maintaining Livonian territorial integrity against Russian expansion. The relief operations that ultimately broke the siege demonstrated the military effectiveness that could be achieved through Confederation cooperation when external threats demanded unified response. The combined Livonian force approached Rakvere through coordinated movements that prevented Russian forces from concentrating their strength against any single threat, while maintaining communication between different contingents advancing from various directions. The tactical coordination required for these operations reflected sophisticated military planning that integrated the diverse capabilities and tactical preferences of different Confederation authorities. The battle that resulted from the convergence of these forces near Rakvere involved approximately 2,500 combatants, representing the largest military engagement in the Baltic region since the major conquest campaigns of the previous century. The Russian forces, despite their numerical advantages and strong defensive positions, found themselves caught between the fortress garrison and the approaching relief forces in a tactical situation that prevented effective utilization of their siege equipment and defensive earthworks. The resulting combat demonstrated the continued effectiveness of German heavy cavalry when employed under favorable tactical conditions, while revealing Russian vulnerabilities when separated from their prepared defensive positions. The Russian withdrawal from Rakvere following their tactical defeat eliminated the immediate threat to Livonian territories while demonstrating the military capabilities that could be mobilized through Confederation cooperation. However, the campaign also revealed significant coordination challenges that limited the effectiveness of combined operations, including communication difficulties, logistical complications, and disagreements over tactical priorities that reflected the underlying political tensions within the Confederation structure. These operational lessons influenced subsequent military planning and contributed to institutional reforms designed to improve coordination during future military emergencies. The territorial consolidation that followed the successful defense against Russian expansion involved systematic strengthening of frontier fortifications and expansion of settlement activities in strategically important border regions. The construction program initiated during the first decade of the 14th century included establishment of numerous smaller strongholds designed to provide early warning of approaching threats while offering secure bases for patrol operations and intelligence gathering activities. These installations incorporated architectural innovations developed through analysis of the Rakvere siege, emphasizing rapid construction techniques and defensive features specifically designed to counter Russian siege capabilities. The settlement policies implemented during this period emphasized establishment of German colonial communities in frontier regions where their presence could provide both economic development and military security against external threats. The colonists recruited for these settlements included experienced farmers, craftsmen, and former soldiers who possessed the skills necessary for developing agricultural activities while maintaining defensive capabilities during military emergencies. The legal privileges granted to frontier settlers included favourable taxation rates, land tenure arrangements, and military service obligations that created incentives for permanent residence in strategically important but potentially dangerous territories. The Moscow expansion that emerged during the mid-14th century represented a qualitatively different challenge from previous Russian threats due to the centralized political authority and enhanced military capabilities developed under Prince Ivan I Kalita and his successors. Moscow's systematic absorption of neighbouring Russian principalities created unprecedented resource concentrations that enabled sustained military operations across vast territorial distances while maintaining sophisticated logistical support systems. The Muscovite military organisation incorporated lessons learned from conflicts with Mongol forces, Lithuanian expansion, and previous encounters with German military techniques. The diplomatic complexities that accompanied Moscow's rise required careful navigation by Livonian authorities who needed to balance defensive preparations against potential military threats with maintenance of profitable trade relationships that provided essential revenues for Confederation activities. Moscow's control over important segments of the Russian trade networks created opportunities for economic cooperation that could benefit all parties, but also generated dependencies that might be exploited during political conflicts. The diplomatic correspondence that developed between Livonian and Muscovite authorities during this period reflected sophisticated understanding of the relationship between commercial and military considerations in frontier diplomacy. The internal political evolution that characterized the Confederation during this period involved gradual institutionalization of the competing authorities and development of formal procedures for managing jurisdictional disputes and coordinating collective activities. The Landtag that emerged as the Confederation's primary deliberative body incorporated representatives from all major authorities including the Teutonic Landmeister, ecclesiastical hierarchy, and urban councils. This institution provided a forum for negotiating agreements on taxation, military obligations, and territorial administration, while preserving the autonomous rights that each authority considered essential for protecting their specific interests. The judicial systems that developed to support this complex political structure incorporated multiple levels of appeal and specialized jurisdictions designed to address the diverse legal traditions and practical requirements of different population groups within the Confederation territories. The ecclesiastical courts maintained jurisdiction over canonical matters, marriage and family disputes, and certain categories of criminal cases involving clerical personnel, while secular authorities administered commercial law, military justice, and civil disputes between lay populations. The coordination required between these various judicial systems created opportunities for legal innovation, while occasionally generating conflicts that required resolution through higher, authorities. The economic integration that accompanied political development involved systematic coordination of taxation policies, commercial regulations, and currency systems that enabled efficient operation of trade networks while generating revenues necessary for supporting military and administrative activities. The monetary policies established during this period included standardization of weights and measures, regulation of currency exchange rates, and coordination of taxation procedures that reduced transaction costs while preventing competitive devaluation that might damage overall economic development. These policies required ongoing negotiation between authorities whose immediate interests often conflicted with broader Confederation objectives. The cultural development that emerged within this political framework reflected the complex interactions between German colonial society, indigenous populations, and external influences from various European regions. The educational institutions established during this period included cathedral schools, urban academies, and specialized training programs that provided instruction in languages, law, theology, and practical skills necessary for administrative and commercial activities. The religious upheaval that swept across Northern Europe during the early 16th century struck at the very foundations of the Livonian Confederation's institutional legitimacy. The Protestant Reformation, initiated by Martin Luther's challenge to papal authority in 1517, created unprecedented theological and political crises throughout territories that had been conquered and governed under explicitly Catholic crusading mandates. The Livonian territories, established through papal bulls that granted spiritual indulgences for military service against pagans, found their fundamental raison d'etre questioned by reformist theologians who rejected the entire framework of crusading ideology and papal temporal authority. Archbishop Wilhelm von Brandenburg of Riga, appointed in 1539, embodied the theological contradictions that plagued ecclesiastical authorities throughout the Reformation period. Wilhelm possessed extensive humanist education and maintained correspondence with leading reformist thinkers, yet his position depended upon papal appointment and canonical authority that Protestant theology explicitly rejected. His attempts to navigate between Catholic orthodoxy and reformist pressures created administrative chaos within his archdiocese as parish priests, cathedral chapters, and monastic communities divided along theological lines that reflected broader European religious conflicts. The urban populations of Riga, Reval, and other commercial centres proved particularly receptive to Protestant teachings that emphasised individual religious conscience and rejected ecclesiastical mediation between believers and divine authority. The merchant families that dominated urban governance had long resented ecclesiastical taxation and canonical restrictions on commercial activities, finding in Lutheran theology a religious justification for asserting independence from Catholic hierarchical control. The Riga City Council formally adopted Lutheran practices in 1522, confiscating ecclesiastical properties and expelling Catholic clergy who refused to accept reformist theological positions. These urban Reformation movements created direct challenges to the Teutonic Order's authority, which derived its legitimacy from papal charters and canonical privileges that Protestant theology rejected as invalid human innovations contrary to scriptural authority. Landmeister Walter von Plettenberg, who had governed the Livonian territories since 1494, found himself caught between competing religious authorities while facing external military pressures that demanded unified command structures. His personal religious convictions remained Catholic, but political necessities required accommodation with Protestant urban authorities who controlled essential commercial revenues and military resources. The theological debates that raged throughout Livonian territories during the 1520s and 1530s extended beyond abstract doctrinal questions to encompass fundamental issues of political authority and social organisation. Protestant reformers challenged not only Catholic sacramental theology, but also the entire feudal structure that had governed conquered territories since the original crusading campaigns. Their emphasis on scriptural authority and individual religious conscience provided ideological foundations for questioning established hierarchies, taxation systems, and legal codes that had developed under Catholic canonical influence. The dissolution of monastic communities throughout Protestant regions eliminated crucial sources of education, healthcare, and agricultural development that had supported both German and indigenous populations for centuries. The Cistercian monasteries at Dunamunde and Falkenau had maintained extensive libraries, scriptoriums, and schools that preserved classical learning while providing practical training in agriculture, crafts, and administrative skills. Their suppression created educational and cultural gaps that secular authorities proved unable to fill adequately, contributing to broader social disruption that weakened resistance to external threats. The indigenous populations, whose conversion to Christianity had remained superficial despite centuries of missionary activity, found in the religious conflicts opportunities to reassert traditional beliefs and practices that had been suppressed under Catholic authority. The theological chaos that characterized the Reformation period reduced ecclesiastical supervision of rural parishes, enabling revival of pagan ceremonies, traditional healing practices, and customary legal procedures that had persisted clandestinely throughout the period of German rule. These religious reversions complicated military recruitment and administrative control in frontier regions where indigenous cooperation remained essential for maintaining security against external threats. The emergence of radical Protestant movements, including in Anabaptist communities that rejected infant baptism and advocated communal property ownership, created additional sources of social instability that diverted resources from military preparations. The Anabaptist settlement established near Venden in 1534 attracted substantial numbers of German colonists and indigenous converts who abandoned their previous social obligations in favour of communal religious practices that conflicted with established feudal relationships. The suppression of these communities required military operations that depleted garrison strengths while generating resentment among populations sympathetic to radical religious reforms. The military challenges that emerged during this period reflected fundamental changes in warfare technology and strategic doctrine that rendered traditional crusading methods obsolete against modernized opponents. The Russian state under Ivan IV had undergone systematic military reforms that incorporated advanced artillery, professional infantry formations, and sophisticated siege techniques developed through conflicts with Ottoman forces and observation of contemporary European military innovations. Russian armies of the 1550s bore little resemblance to the medieval principality forces that had been defeated during earlier Livonian campaigns. Ivan's military organisation emphasised centralised command structures, standardised equipment, and professional training programs that created disciplined formations capable of sustained operations across vast territorial distances. The Streltsy regiments that formed the core of Russian infantry forces received regular pay, uniform equipment, and systematic training in firearms usage that made them formidable opponents in both siege operations and field battles. Their firearms, manufactured in Russian workshops using technology acquired from European sources, provided firepower advantages that neutralized the traditional superiority of German heavy cavalry in open combat. The artillery capabilities developed by Russian forces during the mid-16th century included massive siege cannons capable of breaching stone fortifications that had previously been considered impregnable. The siege train assembled for Ivan's Livonian campaigns included bronze cannons weighing several tons each, transported by specialised teams of engineers and artillerymen who possessed expertise in siege warfare, gained through conflicts with Kazan, Astrakhan, and other fortified positions. These weapons could breach walls that had withstood traditional siege methods, rendering obsolete the defensive systems that had protected Livonian territories for centuries. The tactical innovations employed by Russian forces reflected sophisticated understanding of contemporary European military developments adapted to the specific challenges of Baltic warfare. Russian commanders had studied German military methods through observation of previous conflicts and interrogation of captured personnel, developing countermeasures specifically designed to neutralize traditional German advantages in cavalry operations and fortification systems. Their combined arms formations integrated artillery, infantry and cavalry units in coordinated operations that prevented German forces from exploiting their traditional tactical superiorities. The Livonian military response to these challenges revealed fundamental weaknesses in both equipment and organizational structure that had developed during decades of internal political fragmentation. The Confederation's military forces remained organized according to medieval principles that emphasized individual knightly prowess, rather than coordinated formations required for effective resistance against professional armies equipped with advanced weaponry. The total military strength available to Livonian authorities comprised fewer than 800 knights supported by approximately 2,000 auxiliary troops, numbers that proved inadequate for defending extensive territorial holdings against sustained assault by superior forces. The financial resources available for military modernization remained severely limited due to the economic disruption caused by religious conflicts and competition from alternative trade routes that reduced revenues from traditional commercial activities. The Hanseatic League's declining influence had eliminated crucial sources of external investment, while internal taxation disputes between competing authorities prevented effective coordination of resource allocation for military purposes. The cost of acquiring modern artillery and firearms exceeded the Confederation's financial capabilities, forcing continued reliance on obsolete military equipment that proved ineffective against modernized opponents. The fortification systems that had provided security during earlier periods required extensive modification to counter artillery attacks, but the engineering expertise and financial resources necessary for such reconstruction remained unavailable to most Livonian authorities. The stone walls that protected major strongholds had been designed to resist traditional siege methods rather than cannon fire, requiring complete rebuilding using Trace Italienne principles that incorporated angular bastions and thick earthwork barriers. Only a few major fortifications, including Riga and Reval, received partial modernization that improved their defensive capabilities against artillery attacks. The recruitment crisis that accompanied military modernization reflected both demographic limitations and social changes that reduced the available pool of qualified military personnel. The German colonial population remained numerically small relative to territorial holdings, while religious conflicts had disrupted traditional recruitment networks that had provided replacement personnel from the Holy Roman Empire. The indigenous populations, whose loyalty had always been questionable, proved increasingly unreliable as religious and political authority fragmented during the Reformation period. The corruption that characterized Livonian military and administrative institutions during this period reflected broader social decay that had developed under weak leadership and competing jurisdictional authorities. Military commanders diverted resources intended for fortification construction and equipment procurement to personal enrichment, while administrative officials sold positions and privileges that undermined systematic governance. The discipline that had characterized Teutonic military organization deteriorated as Knight brothers pursued individual advancement rather than collective institutional objectives. The case of Komtur Johann von Taube exemplified the institutional decay that weakened military effectiveness throughout the Confederation territories. Taube had inherited command of Venden Castle through family connections rather than military merit, using his position to engage in commercial activities that conflicted with his military obligations while neglecting essential maintenance of fortifications and equipment. His garrison comprised fewer than 30 effective combatants, many of whom were elderly veterans incapable of sustained military operations or inexperienced recruits lacking proper training and equipment. The supply systems that supported military operations had deteriorated due to corruption, administrative incompetence, and economic disruption that prevented reliable provision of essential materials. Weapons maintenance suffered from lack of skilled craftsmen and adequate raw materials, while food supplies for garrison forces often proved insufficient during extended operations. The magazines that stored ammunition and military equipment frequently contained obsolete or defective materials that had been accepted by corrupt officials seeking personal profit rather than military effectiveness. The intelligence networks that had previously provided crucial information about external threats had largely collapsed due to religious conflicts that eliminated traditional sources of information among indigenous populations and foreign merchants. The conversion of many indigenous communities to Protestantism disrupted established relationships with Catholic authorities, while commercial disruption reduced contact with foreign traders who'd previously provided intelligence about Russian military preparations. The resulting information gaps prevented effective strategic planning and left Livonian forces vulnerable to surprise attacks. The diplomatic isolation that characterized Livonian foreign relations during this period resulted from religious conflicts that eliminated traditional allies while creating new sources of external hostility. The Holy Roman Emperor, preoccupied with Protestant challenges within his own territories and Ottoman threats in southeastern Europe, provided minimal support for distant Baltic territories whose religious loyalty had become questionable. Poland-Lithuania, despite sharing concerns about Russian expansion, maintained complex relationships with various Livonian authorities that prevented effective military cooperation. The internal political manoeuvring that intensified during the final decades of Livonian independence reflected desperate attempts by various authorities to preserve their positions through accommodation with external powers rather than unified resistance against common threats. Gotthard Kettler, the last Landmeister of the Livonian Order, exemplified the pragmatic approach that characterized leadership during this crisis period. Kettler possessed both military experience and diplomatic skills that enabled him to navigate between competing pressures while seeking solutions that might preserve some form of German authority in the Baltic territories. Kettler's negotiations with Polish-Lithuanian authorities reflected his recognition that independent Livonian resistance against Russian expansion had become impossible given the military and political weaknesses that characterized the Confederation. His diplomatic initiatives sought to secure Polish protection for Livonian territories in exchange for acknowledgement of Polish suzerainty, a solution that would preserve local autonomy while providing external military support against Russian threats. These negotiations required careful balance between Polish demands for territorial concessions and Livonian insistence on maintaining traditional privileges and institutional structures. The complexity of these diplomatic arrangements reflected the multiple competing interests that influenced Polish-Lithuanian policy toward the Baltic territories. King Sigismund II, Augustus, sought to expand Polish influence in the region while avoiding direct military confrontation with Russian forces that might escalate into broader European conflicts. The Lithuanian nobility, whose ancestral territories bordered Livonian holdings, maintained their own territorial ambitions that sometimes conflicted with broader Polish strategic objectives. The resulting diplomatic framework required extensive negotiations that addressed territorial boundaries, military obligations, commercial privileges, and religious arrangements that would govern future relationships. The Russian military pressure that intensified during these diplomatic negotiations demonstrated Ivan IV's determination to eliminate German authority from the Baltic territories, regardless of external diplomatic arrangements. Russian forces launched systematic attacks against Livonian strongholds throughout the 1550s, capturing strategic positions that controlled important transportation routes and commercial centres. The Siege of Narva in 1558 marked the beginning of sustained Russian military operations that would ultimately destroy the political independence of the Livonian territories through systematic conquest of their principal fortifications and urban centres. The collapse of Livonian resistance accelerated dramatically following the fall of Narva in May 1558, when Russian artillery breached walls that had protected the strategic port for over 3 centuries. The fortress's capture provided Ivan IV with a crucial Baltic outlet, while eliminating the last major obstacle to Russian domination of northern Estonia. The garrison's surrender after only 3 weeks of siege operations demonstrated the complete inadequacy of traditional fortifications against modern artillery, while the speed of the Russian victory demoralized remaining defenders throughout the Confederation territories. The systematic Russian advance that followed Narva's capture revealed the methodical nature of Ivan's strategic planning for conquering the entire Livonian region. Russian forces moved simultaneously against multiple objectives, preventing effective concentration of German defensive resources while maintaining pressure across the entire frontier. The capture of Dorpat in July 1558 eliminated the last major stronghold in eastern Estonia, while simultaneous operations against Venden and other central fortifications threatened to sever communication links between different Livonian territories. This coordinated assault demonstrated sophisticated military planning that exploited German weaknesses while preventing the defensive coordination that might have prolonged resistance. Gotthard Kettler's recognition of the hopeless military situation led to increasingly desperate diplomatic initiatives designed to secure external intervention before complete Russian conquest eliminated all negotiating leverage. His correspondence with Polish King Sigismund II Augustus emphasized the strategic importance of preventing Russian control over Baltic ports that would threaten Polish commercial interests and provide Moscow with direct access to Western European military technology. Kettler's arguments stress that Polish intervention represented not merely assistance to German allies, but essential defense of Polish strategic interests against Russian expansion that would ultimately threaten Polish territories. The Polish response to these appeals reflected the complex internal politics that influenced Lithuanian-Polish decision-making regarding Baltic affairs. The Lithuanian nobility, whose ancestral territories had included extensive Baltic holdings before German conquest, viewed the Livonian crisis as an opportunity to reclaim traditional territorial rights while preventing Russian expansion into regions they considered within their legitimate sphere of influence. However, Polish nobles remained reluctant to commit substantial military resources to distant territories whose defence might require prolonged warfare against Russian forces equipped with modern military technology. The military situation that confronted Polish strategic planners revealed the enormous challenges involved in effective intervention against Russian forces that had achieved tactical momentum through their initial successes. Russian armies operating in Livonian territories comprised professional formations equipped with advanced artillery and supported by sophisticated logistical systems that enabled sustained operations across vast distances. The Streltsy regiments that formed the core of Russian infantry possessed firearm training and battlefield experience that made them formidable opponents in both siege operations and field engagements against traditional European military formations. The Treaty of Vilnius negotiations that commenced in August 1561 represented Kettler's final attempt to preserve some form of German authority in the Baltic territories. Through acceptance of Polish suzerainty in exchange for military protection against Russian expansion, these diplomatic discussions required extensive consultation with various Livonian authorities whose competing interests complicated unified negotiating positions. Archbishop Wilhelm von Brandenburg insisted upon preservation of ecclesiastical privileges and territorial holdings, while urban representatives demanded guarantees for commercial autonomy and traditional trading relationships with Hanseatic partners. The complexity of these negotiations reflected fundamental disagreements about the future political structure of territories that had been conquered and governed through distinctly German institutional arrangements for over 3 centuries. Polish negotiators sought to establish clear, hierarchical relationships that would integrate Livonian territories into existing Polish administrative systems, while German authorities attempted to preserve autonomous privileges that would maintain their traditional governmental roles under nominal Polish oversight. The resulting diplomatic framework required extensive compromise that satisfied neither party completely while providing practical solutions for immediate military necessities. Kettler's personal conversion to Lutheranism during these negotiations represented both theological conviction and political calculation, designed to strengthen his position with Protestant Polish nobles, who might support greater autonomy for reformed territories. His public embrace of Protestant theology eliminated potential Catholic objections to his continued authority, while demonstrating alignment with religious reforms that had gained substantial support among Polish and Lithuanian nobility. However, this religious transformation also severed his connections with Catholic institutional structures that had provided legitimacy for military order governance since the original crusading period. The formal dissolution of the Livonian order occurred through a series of legal documents signed at Vilnius on September 15, 1561, which transferred territorial authority from the military order to secular ducal administration under Polish-Lithuanian suzerainty. The treaty provisions established Gotthard Kettler as Duke of Courland and Semigalia, with hereditary rights extending to his legitimate heirs, while acknowledging Polish royal authority over foreign policy, military affairs, and ultimate judicial appeal. These arrangements preserved local administrative autonomy, while providing external military protection against Russian expansion that had proven beyond German capabilities. The territorial arrangements established through the Vilnius Treaty created the Duchy of Courland and Semigalia as a vassal state encompassing the southwestern portions of the former Livonian territories, including strategic coastal regions that controlled access to important Baltic ports. The duchy's boundaries extended from the Daugava River southward to the Lithuanian frontier, encompassing approximately 28,000 square kilometres of territory that included substantial German colonial populations alongside indigenous Latvian communities. The northern and eastern territories, including Estonia and much of central Livonia, remained under direct Russian occupation pending future diplomatic resolution. The administrative transformation that accompanied this political restructuring required systematic adaptation of existing governmental institutions to accommodate ducal authority while preserving functional relationships with Polish-Lithuanian oversight mechanisms. Kettler's ducal administration incorporated experienced German administrators who possessed essential knowledge of local conditions and established relationships with various population groups, while accepting Polish appointment of key officials responsible for military affairs and foreign policy coordination. This hybrid administrative structure maintained operational continuity while acknowledging new political realities that governed external relationships. The religious settlement that emerged from these arrangements reflected the complex theological situation that had developed during the Reformation period, with Lutheran practices becoming officially established throughout ducal territories, while Catholic populations retained limited rights to maintain their traditional religious observances. The former ecclesiastical territories were secularized and incorporated into ducal administration, with their revenues redirected towards supporting governmental functions and military obligations to Polish suzerainty. Former Catholic clergy who accepted Lutheran theology received positions within the new religious establishment, while those who refused faced exile or marginalization within the transformed religious landscape. The economic implications of this political transformation extended far beyond immediate administrative changes to encompass fundamental restructuring of commercial relationships and taxation systems that had developed over centuries of German rule. The duchy's integration into Polish-Lithuanian commercial networks provided access to new markets and trading partners, while reducing dependence on traditional Hanseatic relationships that had been disrupted by political upheaval and military conflicts. However, this economic reorientation also subjected ducal territories to Polish taxation demands and military obligations that absorbed substantial portions of local revenues. The cultural impact of the order's dissolution represented the end of a unique medieval institution that had shaped Baltic society through 3.5 centuries of military conquest, religious conversion, and colonial administration. The Livonian Brothers of the Sword and their Teutonic successors had created distinctive architectural, legal, and social traditions that reflected the synthesis of German, indigenous, and broader European influences within the specific context of frontier crusading society. The dissolution of this institutional framework eliminated the organisational structures that had maintained these cultural traditions while opening the region to new influences from Polish, Lithuanian, and other European sources. The architectural legacy of the military orders remained visible throughout the Baltic territories in the massive stone castles, urban fortifications, and ecclesiastical buildings that had been constructed during centuries of German rule. Venden Castle, despite suffering damage during the final military campaigns, preserved its distinctive combination of military functionality and administrative sophistication that exemplified Teutonic architectural principles adapted to Baltic conditions. The fortress's multiple defensive perimeters, underground passages, and specialised facilities for siege warfare demonstrated engineering techniques that had enabled small German garrisons to control extensive territories against numerically superior indigenous forces. Riga's urban development under military order governance had created one of the most sophisticated commercial centres in Northern Europe, with harbour facilities, warehouse complexes, and residential districts that reflected systematic planning designed to integrate military, religious, and economic functions within unified defensive systems. The city's churches, including St. Peter's and the Cathedral, incorporated architectural elements that combined German Gothic traditions with local building materials and construction techniques, creating distinctive regional variations that influenced ecclesiastical architecture throughout the Baltic region for centuries after the order's dissolution. The legal traditions established during the period of military order governance continued to influence judicial procedures and administrative practices throughout the ducal period and beyond. The Livonian legal code that had evolved through centuries of practical experience in governing ethnically diverse populations provided precedents for addressing disputes between different cultural groups while maintaining overall systemic coherence. These legal innovations included procedures for managing property rights, commercial relationships, and criminal justice that reflected the specific challenges of frontier society, while incorporating elements from German customary law, canonical regulations, and indigenous legal traditions. The urban privileges that had been granted to major commercial centres during the military order period established patterns of municipal autonomy that persisted under ducal administration and influenced the development of civic institutions throughout the early modern period. The guild systems that had regulated craft production and commercial activities in Riga, Reval, and other urban centres created organisational structures that maintained professional standards while providing social support networks for German and indigenous artisans. These institutional arrangements continued to function under ducal authority while adapting to changing economic conditions and political requirements. The educational institutions that had developed under military order patronage, including cathedral schools and urban academies, established intellectual traditions that continued to influence cultural development throughout the region long after the dissolution of their original sponsors. The libraries and scriptoriums that had been maintained by monastic communities preserved classical texts and chronicles that provided essential sources for understanding Baltic history, while maintaining connections with broader European intellectual developments. Although many of these institutions were disrupted by religious reforms and political upheaval, Their educational traditions influenced the development of schools and universities that served the region's intellectual needs during subsequent periods. The demographic impact of German colonization under military order governance created lasting changes in the ethnic composition and social structure of Baltic territories that persisted throughout the early modern period. The German colonial communities that had been established in strategic locations throughout Livonia and Estonia maintained their distinctive cultural characteristics while adapting to changed political circumstances under ducal and later Swedish and Russian rule. These communities preserved German language, legal traditions, and social customs that influenced regional development while contributing specialized skills in agriculture, crafts, and commerce that benefited the broader population. The indigenous populations that had been incorporated into the military order's territorial system experienced complex processes of cultural change that combined elements of Germanization with preservation of traditional practices and beliefs. The conversion to Christianity, while often superficial during the medieval period, had introduced new religious concepts and institutional structures that influenced indigenous worldviews while coexisting with traditional spiritual practices. The legal protections and economic opportunities that had been extended to cooperative indigenous communities created social mobility patterns that persisted under subsequent political arrangements. The military traditions established by the Brothers of the Sword and their Teutonic successors influenced the development of professional military institutions throughout the Baltic region during the early modern period. The fortification techniques, tactical innovations, and organizational procedures that had been developed through centuries of frontier warfare provided models for later military establishments, while demonstrating the importance of disciplined training and systematic logistics in maintaining effective defense capabilities. The castle networks that had been constructed during the military order period continued to serve strategic functions under subsequent political arrangements, while requiring adaptation to changing military technology and strategic requirements. The commercial networks that had been developed under military order governance established trading relationships and transportation systems that continued to influence Baltic commerce throughout the early modern period. The privileges that had been granted to Hanseatic merchants and other commercial partners created legal precedents and institutional arrangements that facilitated continued trade relationships while adapting to changing political circumstances. The harbour facilities, road networks, and commercial regulations that had been established during the medieval period provided infrastructure that supported economic development under subsequent political arrangements. The religious impact of the military order's evangelical mission created lasting changes in the spiritual landscape of the Baltic territories that persisted despite the disruption caused by Protestant reforms and political transformation. The parish system that had been established throughout conquered territories provided organizational structures for religious instruction and community support that continued to function under Lutheran administration while adapting to Reformed theological principles. The churches and monasteries that had been constructed during the Catholic period were converted to Protestant use while maintaining their architectural significance and community functions. The historical significance of the Livonian Brothers of the Sword extended far beyond their specific territorial conquests to encompass their role in the broader European expansion that characterized the medieval period. Their military and administrative innovations contributed to the development of institutional arrangements that enabled small numbers of European colonists to establish lasting control over extensive territories populated by indigenous peoples with different cultural traditions. The legal, military and religious institutions that they developed provided models for colonial enterprises in other regions while demonstrating both the possibilities and limitations of medieval expansion efforts. The ultimate failure of the Livonian military orders to maintain independent political existence reflected fundamental changes in military technology, political organization, and religious authority that characterized the transition from medieval to early modern European society. Their dissolution marked the end of the crusading movement as an effective instrument for territorial expansion, while demonstrating the vulnerability of medieval institutional arrangements to the centralizing pressures and technological innovations that define the emerging early modern state system. However, the institutional legacy continued to influence the development of Baltic society through legal traditions, architectural monuments, and cultural practices that preserved elements of their distinctive contribution to European civilization. The transformation of the military order territories into the Duchy of Kurland and Semigalia represented not merely political adaptation to changed circumstances, but the evolution of medieval colonial institutions into early modern state structures that could function effectively within the emerging European political system. This institutional transformation preserved essential elements of the German colonial achievement, while adapting to new political realities that required accommodation with larger and more powerful neighbouring states. The duchy's subsequent development demonstrated both the durability of institutions established during the military order period and their capacity for adaptation to changing historical circumstances that would continue to influence Baltic development for centuries to come.